And Robbie, maybe you can record now too.
It's going now. So, I mean, FYI for everyone here, we are going to record. So there is your disclosure. If Zoom did not give you the pop-up already.
Sorry. Okay, is it working? Does everyone see clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not flickering for me anymore. It was for a second. Okay, so this is the third seance of What is Metaphysics, where we are continuing Kant, and after we will move on. We had an amazing presentation by Finn on Hume. There's a slide we'll review, and an amazing presentation on Kant, focusing on the prolegomena by Chris, which is also super helpful to understand where we're going today. My part of the presentation is the metapsychology part. Robert's is like the man part, or humankind. So I'm trying to think of metaphysics as a metapsychology, or as Kant's initial critique as already doing all the work that we think of with Freud and his metapsychological critique, displacing the self-reflexive Cartesian subject, as it were. But the Freudianism will be unconscious here, and I will only talk about the first critique and towards the end a little bit of French neo-Kantianism. So we have seen an extreme in empiricism, where if the empirical is not merely denounced altogether, right, it is thought to be self-revelatory, identical to the thing in itself, where measurements, calculations, the concepts of space themselves and time are real and they're actual. This is basically the ground of analytic philosophy and empirical science. For Kant, and for all continental philosophers after him, as we'll see, this is simply not so. It's not this simple. The world is not mappable like this in this Cartesian plane so neatly. There will be something like a remainder, a residual of both the transcendental and the real. And that's kind of the common theme I want to pull through from Kant all the way to the present. This image represents idealism, as we saw with the rationalists like in Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, etc. So the other side, right, the British empiricists would have been the previous slide. So idealists believe that they are beyond, that they're going beyond empiricism, and that metaphysics can map out and reveal in its perfect totality the harmony of the universe. And so the universe is projectively identified as something rational because we're using reason. And so we assume that the universe is also just as ordered by reason, analogous to our own. In this, God reveals himself to man, fully, generously, as Malabou will say in a video shortly. And consequently, meaning isn't threatened by the false consciousness of experience. So that skeptical impulse, it doesn't touch idealism. It's not threatened by it. Experience is just over there and consequential. We're just going to use our reason over here, like a sort of pure subjectivity or subjective approach to ontology. All of this until Kant's critique. And this kind of reduces it. I'm not, almost biologizes it. It's not what I'm trying to do. So, you know, like this is not a blend of idealism and empiricism so simply, because the ontological systems are fairly mutually exclusive. Transcendental idealism in Kant, or what he also calls critical idealism, so a revision, a thorn in idealism, accepts that reason can lead to where experience or understanding cannot follow. That's Kant's actual definition, and that this mode of inquiry both enables, makes possible, while at once limiting the range of potential for actualizing a metaphysics. So there is a use of reason in us that does just transcend empiricism, yet we have to think it through experience still. So this creates a sort of tautology, as we'll see moving forward. When I say metaphysics is metapsychology, I want to also say something like the queering or deconstructing of a clean difference between ontology and epistemology, the being in itself and how we know truth about things. How are we doing? In truth, I just wrote down that I should read this out, and I haven't looked at it in a while. This is from Finn's presentation. And this is true, right? That the way Hume will see it, it does foreclose metaphysics because there's no way to deduce, as Kant will, that things are causally necessary. That we can look at anything in the world and think that anything is causally necessary about how we're looking at the world. For Hume, it will be more a question of habit. I don't know, Finn, do you want to add before I move on? Because I feel like I'm not really addressing the whole side. If you want to mention a tidbit, you don't have to. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, I was struck by the you said, or that I unfortunately didn't do the reading, but you said that Kant was saying that reason can go further than experience. What do we think he means exactly by that? I think I kind of personally tend much more towards a William James pragmatist experience is mostly everything. So how does reason go further?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge he wants to address in general. What can be knowable given this limit? And I think he wants to show that there's certain universal categories that structure our experience, and the way to speak about them is to make deductions that are logical. So there's a reason why I'm going to be arguing how influenced the postmoderns are and how much they walk on the ground of Kant, but at the same time, it's very clear why they would want to resist him, and that they do. It's an ambivalent inheritance completely, because nobody wants to touch like innatism, some kind of universal, some kind of determinism. But what I hope to also reveal is that like it can't be an absolute determinism. There's a plasticity there, and I think that's a saving grace that we can mobilize.
And can you repeat what you said about epistemology and ontology? Were you indicating that there is a blurring of the line between the two in Kant?
That's how I understand it. Yeah. I don't know if I should speak too much now because it's really the chunk of the presentation, but it's we're deducing experience only through the logic that we can use before experience, and we're going to prove that it is regular and necessary under certain universal laws. And what happens when you do that is you're thinking epistemology through ontology and ontology through epistemology sort of at the same time, because your metaphysics is explaining how a certain reality came to be. So that's already an ontological question, and that certain reality is experience itself. It's the conscious being, the thinking being. And so in a way, he feels that the rationalists and the empiricists are sidestepping this great problem. And instead we need to like deal with that undecidability, or that tension, that tension between how we know and knowing for real.
If I just might, Edie, I mean, I mean, this is the critique, the process of critique that Kant is undertaking. I mean, he recognizes in Hume that contrary to the glorious Enlightenment thinkers, in which reason is what separates us from, the irrationality of the Dark Ages and, the animals, he saw that Hume sort of deconstructs reason and shows that reason isn't as powerful as we say it is. And so Kant is, through this process of critique, this systematic scientific look at every single bit of this and constructing this system, he's going to re-elevate reason to the highest authority. And he's going to, through this critique of pure reason, he's going to show these sort of rational structures. I mean, he's an extreme rationalist in a way. And he's also going to show in the second critique that practical reason shows us that there are necessary, obligatory universal moral laws. And even in faith, he's going to show that actually faith, which is typically seen as, the contrary to is sort of the irrational, right? He's going to say that faith is a rationally justified belief. So, I mean, the whole project is to analyze reason, to go into the nooks and crannies of our whole experience, how we know how we are in the world, and kind of reinvigorate reason in a way. So, of course, I mean, it's tied to experience, but as Kant is going to say, that experience itself is already conditioned by, the forms of intuition, the categories, so reason is already active before we even see the computer in front of you. Your mind is already providing these coordinates of experience, which allows you to have these experiences. And all of this is rational and reasonable, and it fits into this really interrelated system. Sorry.
And it's caused, we have here in your slide. I don't know if you want to speak a tiny bit to this for a second.
On what? Sorry, what?
We're looking at your slide. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, hold on. Well, I mean, this slide on Hume's deconstruction?
It was related to what you're saying, like the limit of reason and how we deal with
Well, typically both sort of empiricists and rationalists, before Hume, they said we know things because, through rationality. Causation, for example, that's a causal necessity. Everyone explained that, B is produced, A happens and B is produced, and that relationship is a question of reason, of causal necessity. And Hume is pointing out, sort of deconstructing that, really looking at that link and saying, wait a minute, if we take the empiricist picture seriously, in that, we have if everything is a question of empirical experience, then what is it that connects two experiences, right? These kind of atomistic experiences, and he says it's not reason. It's actually a leap of the imagination, right? So in other words, what the tradition has taken as sort of rationally necessary causality, Hume is saying, no, we make that leap because we need to. We need to make our way in the world, but that leap to say that A causes B, the causal link is not something that is not a rationally justified belief. It's a question of custom. It's a question of habit. We have to make the leap because we have to live. but in other words, for Hume, the world is not something that we can really know. It's not a question of knowing. I mean, to a certain extent it is, but not like the rationalists and previous people said. So, I mean, that's the thing. And Kant sees that, okay, well, what does this do? Well, geez, if it's not a question of rationality, then what does it do to science? Science, the whole power of science is its predictive possibilities. And this is the problem of induction. You know, every morning I'm nourished by my yogurt and muesli or whatever. And how can I know that tomorrow's breakfast will nourish me? Well, Hume is saying, well, we're not actually rationally justified in making that claim. Well, that's the whole thing of science, right? You gather, Galileo didn't measure every single, thing rolling down an inclined plane. He couldn't, right? He measured certain things and he used mathematics to show that under these conditions, this necessarily has to be the case for any marble rolling down. And Kant is constructing the system that makes, repositions reason as the center and makes Hume's skepticism, frankly, impossible. Like, we can't be skeptical of the world because the world comes basically from subjective foundations in a sense, which itself is
and necessary natural causes, as I would like to demonstrate. I mean, I think what I would like to hope to emphasize in the transcendental deduction is that Hume's leap or imagination, this critique is valid. It's just that there's no reason to get nihilistic about it. That what he will say is that even that leap or imagination process itself is a necessary, formal, regular, lawful, natural process in the world as thing in itself. Which means he solves this problem, says like we can have transcendental knowledge. He already offers one piece of it. So is a priori synthetic knowledge possible? Do you agree with Kant already, based on intuition or based on the reading, that that experience must be necessary and objectively valid? Do you know how many times you've orbited the sun? Like, do you have a doubt about it? Like, who's willing to stake their entire academic career arguing that they don't know how many times they've orbited the sun truly? Anybody? Would you deconstruct that? And here's some other questions, like how do we know any of these things? How could we pretend to know any of these things? How could we pretend to know about the unconscious? I mean, it goes further. All of these things rest on a priori synthetic knowledge to a degree. They have a transcendental mode of inquiry. They speak about something before it's actualized, before it's given an experience, before it has form, an identity, or it's particularized in the ontic. So quick examples in Foucault, you have a body that's invested with biopolitical technology, right? Every time Foucault talks about this, he like lists a bunch of organic processes like blood flowing and digestion and all this stuff. And he's saying that at the level of the mechanics of the raw body, the normativity is being reinvested by some outside force that wants to reconstitute that normativity insidiously. And the subjectivized subject later will be affected by this conditioning, the certain conditions of different possibility, a biopoliticized possibility of the affected subject. Deconstruction, we'll go, this is much shorter. There will be contradictions that must be smoothed over for the contiguity of the text. So this also implies that there's an unconscious to the text that is the wellspring of infinite polysemia and readings. And fantasy is understood as, this is gender performativity, Butler, so fantasy is understood as like introjected, superegoically introjected, like cultural material about what sexuality and gender are supposed to be, become fantasies that haunt all of us. And they condition both what it means to have a normative gender, but they also condition just as much what it means to have a non-normative gender and the possibilities for pushing the sex gender system from within. Okay, so that's sort of the intro. This is where we'll formally begin with a tiny bit of Aristotle. So I will revisit what the transcendental means at the end of the presentation once we've opened up like that there is transcendental knowledge to be had through the transcendental deduction, meaning that the synthesis producing experience is necessary, it is lawful. We'll have to continue this meeting. But I would like to begin with like a very overly simplified version of what the transcendental could be thought as. Kant is, of course, reinvigorating metaphysics as something, as a very critical project in a way that had not been done, he says, and many believe him, for 1,000 years. And he's doing so by rejuvenating Aristotle's logic. And Hegel will be reading Aristotle's logic, and until Heidegger and Levinas, there's really a faithfulness to Aristotelianism that isn't really questioned ever until we get to Parmenides and an interest in the pre-Socratics. But otherwise, almost the entirety of our continental tradition is sort of stabilized on this. And you can almost think of Derrida, who says, like, you know, there's the now, there's presence, and the other of presence is the other, the past, the possible, right? So the other of the actual here is the potential. Okay. What is held in potentiality in an ontological space can make necessary, makes possible and necessary beings in actu, which is the scholastic or like medieval version of referring to the actual existence. So it's a being in action, in action. You see this all the time in Spinoza. Yeah. Okay. So. And you see this here already in Aristotle. He says actuality in the strict sense is thought to be identical with movement. Actuality then is the existence of a thing not in the way which we express by potentiality. We say that potentially, for instance, a statue exists in a block of wood, etc. You know, the waking to the sleeping, that which is seeing to that which has eyes shut but has sight. So, yeah. That makes sense, more or less, right? That kind of stabilizes transcendentals. Like the a priori is the making possible before something is actually existing, such as our experience as something that actually exists. Okay. So es gibt, there is. That means there is in the world, in the phenomenal world. And that will be a refrain repeated in different German thinkers. And here it means that objects are given to us. So I don't impose, at least from experience, I don't impose. Not the empirical subject does not impose forms in experience. It's not some empirical subject imposing a form onto an empirical object. Rather, something before is both giving me the empirical objects of myself and the object in front of me. So the subject is already an object. The subject is not an other, je et un autre, Rimbaud and Lacan, but the subject is already an object, which is already within the space of metapsychology. This is Freud's little map of the psychic apparatus. So I'm just going to read from my notes a second. Metapsychology implies that we cannot take the world at face value, nor ourselves, nor our own motives, nor the temporality of consciousness, for the unconscious is timeless. The psychoanalytic subject explicitly extends the Kantian subject, the original displacement of the direct access to the real world And the real whole self we associate with this critique that we associate with postmodernism, really like this, everything's constructed, you can't take the reality at face value, it's a translation, it's belated, all of this is already in Kant. So nothing really postmodern about it. It's the height of modernity. I'm not going to read this quote, it'll slow us down too much, but basically the way in which we produce these objects is our thrownness or Geworfenheit. And this opening of the possibility of experience, like in self-opening, is a revealing, an opening unto. That's what that Kant quote is mostly talking about there. I've covered all of that. So I don't give it, non lo dato, lo prendo. I take it, I grasp something that is given to me. Data, by the way, of course, is just given. It just means given. Dado in Spanish, donné in French, given, dato. And where does this happen? This is what we're saying. It happens a priori in a synthesis before experience, someplace, as Lacan might say, barred. Okay, so that's good. I want to make this more clear, and so someone that speaks more clearly on it. That is okay. Crap. I'm having issues. Okay.
In a pure image, but this pure Heidegger, this precise mask, pure image through the visible picture. That is, any reference to God. To understand transcendental imagination and the opening that it brings, we have to understand it without any reference to God. So what is then a pure image if we dissociate it from the Christian notion of revelation? In paragraph 20 of Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, Heidegger takes the example of a photograph. He says, what is an image? What is a pure image? He says, let's take an example. The photograph, and this photograph is the photograph of a death mask. So, okay, we have a death mask, and let's try, starting from there, to understand and explain what a pure image is. Instead of starting with God and trying to show that a pure image belongs to an understanding which is not ours, because we wouldn't be able to produce such a unity between the idea or the concept and the predicate, he says, let's start with the concrete picture. That is this particular mask. What do we see in this picture? In fact, he says, when we look at the picture, an empirical one, we always have two images in one. We always have two meanings of the visible in one. Because when we look at this particular death mask, we see that the death mask, I quote Heidegger, is also capable of showing how something resembling a death mask appears in general. So in fact, when we look at this particular mask, we also see, without seeing it, it's pure image, we also see what is it to be a death mask in general. Okay? So this particular mask gives us access to what being a mask is. So the ontological appears as well. We can see that the being of a mask in general and this mask in particular stick together. So in that sense, we have a synthesis. But instead of starting from above with the idea of a mask and then joining the mask, the particular mask, we see the idea of the mask through the particular visibility of that mask.
I'm going to say this after, but what Hegel is saying is sort of much more akin to idealism, and what Heidegger is saying is very true to Kantianism.
An image does have always an ontic dimension. It is the manifestation of or aspect of a particular being, but it has also an ontological one, which shows the appearing of what appears, the visibility of the visible. But what is the profound difference with Hegel? Contrarily to what Hegel affirms in Revelation, the pure image remains itself invisible. Okay? When we see the particular mask, we have the idea of what a mask is in general. But this idea itself is not visible. It remains at the level of imagination. Rather than for Hegel, it is visible, because it is precisely the idea. It is visible by the mind. Rather than for Heidegger, it remains visible as invisible. It remains visible as a question. The condition of manifestation for Heidegger never comes itself into presence. Something remains unrevealed in the revealed. We see the general image of the mask through its non-appearing in this precise mask. And this is the profound difference between manifestation and revelation. Because according to Heidegger, this is exactly what Kant says, that the concept and the predicate are hold together in a pure image, but this pure image itself is not visible. Rather than what Hegel wants to do, and this is idealism, is to show that this image itself is visible, and this is precisely the ideal that for Hegel, as you know, is visible by spirit, and this is the meaning of the revelation. Nothing remains secret.
Good to go.
Visible as invisible, it remains visible as a question. The condition of manifestation for Heidegger never comes itself into presence. Something remains unrevealed in the revealed. We see the general image of the mask through its non-appearing in this precise mask. And this is the profound difference between manifestation and revelation. Because according to Heidegger, this is exactly what Kant says, that the concept and the predicate are hold together in a pure image, but this pure image itself is not visible. Rather than what Hegel wants to do, and this is idealism, is to show that this image itself is visible, and this is precisely the ideal that for Hegel, as you know, is visible by spirit, and this is the meaning of the revelation. Nothing remains secret. Everything is visible. God gives himself without any jealousy, without any secret. So, you know the argument for Heidegger. The image will appear as a difference, as difference. We see the mask, we see the idea of the mask, but what we really see is the difference between them, because the idea of the mask we don't see. For Hegel, the idea of the mask comes with the mask. We both see the mask and its idea, and it is the great difference. On the one hand, you have revelation, everything appears, including the idea of the mask. In the other case, you have opening, but not revelation. What appears is the mask, and the idea of the mask itself remains invisible. Withdrawn, Heidegger will say.
Okay, that's enough. Is the screen flickering for other people or just me?
Just black right now.
Was it black the whole time? Or?
We got like a minute of her video.
Could you hear it at least?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm really sorry. I don't know why this is happening. I'm going to continue with a PDF. Maybe that helps. Is it better now?
Yeah, we can see.
That's working.
That is?
Yes.
I think you're back now.
Yeah, I don't understand what happened. My computer restarted. Okay.
While you're working on that, I think that this aspect of what is not revealed ends up being, is a great clip you shared. I think it ends up getting to the crux of a lot of the issue around the a priori and whether what is not revealed is whether it exists in potentiality or in actuality, and then therefore do we have access to it epistemologically or even ontologically. And then you mentioned Levinas earlier, but the question of whether infinity, in confrontation, in engagement, in encounter with infinity, that which is not revealed is not something that is withheld, like aletheia, like the thing that's inside that you have to get to, but may not even yet exist. It's the infinity of the noumena that isn't withholding anything, and it's not that you're blocked from it, it's that it is itself infinite. And this question about the a priori as a grasp over the infinite, an attempt to capture it, is what certainly Levinas's critique of Kant was. And I thought that was a really helpful clip.
I'm gonna, let's see. Maybe this is better. Is this better?
You can see it.
Good. So it's better. It's better already.
Step one.
Okay. So I thought we would just look at the psychology, as it were, because the psychological theory in Kant is like sort of the situation or the tools he'll use to perform the transcendental deduction and save us from all this skepticism and restore our faith about being able to know things and that things can be necessary and causally determined. So the noumenal is what we've been calling the thing in itself. It is what it is. It is what is phenomenalized. It is not some other thing. So further down, you'll see that there's a dual aspect monist interpretation, which is the continental inheritance, more or less. And then in analytic philosophy, they debate between this and a two-world interpretation, where I have an object in my head of the thing, and there's another object, and they exist in like these parallel universes, basically. But no, we are phenomenalizing the thing in itself, even if Kant repeats constantly that you don't know the thing in itself, you don't touch the thing in itself. It's like, well, you do touch it phenomenally, you phenomenalize it. So the thing in itself is the objective referent of the phenomenal object. But at the same time, given the way he's always limiting it and using it in a restrictive sense, it's also whatever remainder, whatever is left as unphenomenalizable. And so this is like, we can already hear this Kantianism in Lacan, who's Freud and Lacan are some of the most faithful Kantians. Lacan will say that the real is that which is unsymbolizable. So all of this, and Kant can still affirm that something in itself necessitates our experience. So the big question is how? That is the transcendental deduction, we're getting there. By its necessity will be proven that mental faculties, something noumenal, causes experience necessarily. So instead of thinking, how does the subject all up in myself, right? This is before his displacement, where the quote unquote self is actually an object. And the subject is barred in a priori. But the traditional question before Kant is, how does a subject get to know the object? Can it know the object or not? Kant's like, how does the object, a thing in itself, come to produce a subject? And it's that process there, that synthesis, this a priori synthesis of experience, that will be deemed and proven as necessary, and will allow us to go about with metaphysics instead of just throwing our hands up, you know, as was the situation when he arrived to it. Okay, so I don't expect any, or most of us, if any of us, to read this German. So I have another image for that over here. And this is a sort of map of how we process things in the real world. So it passes through sensibility. And this should be read as actually a understanding. And those are the two faculties. The transcendental subject, it means we're referring to the faculties, or even the drives, if you want, of producing experience, including the experience of the self. And those two faculties are sensibility and understanding. Sensibility deals with the sensuous. It gets sensory data, pulls it in. And the concepts apply logical distinctions. Where are we? 13. I'm going to read a quote from Kant. Sensibility, our passive cognitive faculty, imposes its form, space, and time on the sensations that result from it being affected by things as they are in themselves. So the thing in itself affects the body. There's an affectation in the body. The resulting manifold of empirical intuitions. Intuitions can also be thought of as, the German is Anschauung, so it's a looking at, having been looked at, or something like an image, something like an image. But an image with a point of view. The resulting manifold of empirical intuitions is then unified, synthesized, according to the rules specified by the categories. Categories are concepts of the understanding, so not confuse and leave this vocabulary. We're just still talking about the understanding. This is done by our active cognitive faculties, the understanding, with the help of its ever-ready lieutenant, the imagination. Okay. Sensory, this is not Kant anymore. Sensibility takes sensory information and composes it in space as an intuition. This is still not an experience, but is a priori to experience. The understanding takes the intuition from the sensibility and conceptually orders it, makes it particular, connects it with reason. This transcendental subject produces all objects of experience, including the ego and reality. Okay. So it enables it, gives it life, while at the same time limiting it, restricting it. Intuitions without concepts are blind, Kant will say. As you see, all of these a priori syntheses are within the realm of what we call the thing in itself. All of these, there's a threefold synthesis within all these faculties, and every step of that way, forming the intuition, concept, etc. All of this is a thing in itself. We're talking transcendentally here because we're talking about things beyond experience. This is a transcendental presentation of a certain kind of reality, as it actually is. Okay, this is slide 15. I basically have said this already. What I want to stress here is that this synthesis is necessary. So if we can claim this, then we have something necessary in the world. The thing that Kant will focus on first, that will expand, but even just this small part of the unity of apperception, this happens in the sensibility still, it's an intuition. This small part is just the ability to locate oneself in space. Intuition space is implied to sensory information as an intuition in the sensibility. And the fact that you will always find yourself not only in space and time, but in the same place here, this I, and that it's all together. Not only is my one experience in this moment together and organized, but it's organized with past and future experiences in a totally predictable way. So just this, which is something that Hume kind of spoke to a little bit, but he didn't identify and prove and show that it was necessary and lawful, and that that necessary process is happening before experience, and therefore, ... we have causality. Experience is not chaotic, contingent, it is necessary. Suppose that cinnabar were now red, then black, now light, then heavy, change now into this, then into that. Imagination could not even get the opportunity, when presenting red color, to come to think of heavy cinnabar, as Kant says. It conforms to an ability that is a priori. It conforms to a potentiality to produce the actual, to go to Aristotle. Let me see if I can just get the... Okay. Can we see everything, or just...
You can see. The YouTube's not playing yet, though. I don't know.
Okay, okay. Actually, let me do this. Okay.
So to conclude on that concept, I think that Meyesu has touched an important point. To attempt to define something which render the very notion of possibility itself contingent. The speculative concept of radical contingent to develop before my conclusion, I'm not really convinced, even if as you can see, I take that very seriously. Purely contingent, that is, in a way, beyond the possible and the impossible. To attempt to define a new relationship to otherness through mathematics allows us to elaborate the Kantorian notion of de-totalization, also known Kant and Hume still share. That Kant says everything is necessary, and this is...
Okay, whatever. I'm going to paraphrase, because I feel a little self-conscious trying to find it, and I don't need her to talk that much. So what she's going to say is there's been a recent critique against Kant within the Kantian tradition, saying we need to move beyond the transcendental, we need to relinquish this separation. It's Kant and Meyesu in After Finitude. And he's saying that this correlation between the subject and object that the transcendental proves as something necessary in the world, he's saying that we never really proved that. And he's saying that, in fact, the world is contingent. It doesn't have these a priori laws. It's contingent. It's all actual, but first of all, it's all actual, and it's contingent. It can become anything. This is true in Spinoza too. Supposedly, the body can become anything, yet it doesn't. Yet it doesn't. And so, why does the world turn? Why is the sun rising every morning? Why do I have to eat? Why does this never change? Why have I not learned how to breathe water and become one of the dolphins? It's a real question. Oh, well, the author feigns, because, the world is contingent, yet, it can't become absolutely anything. Malabou's like, what does that mean? What is a radical contingency that has an authentic and an inauthentic contingency? No, that would be too chaotic. A world without necessary structure in a potentiality defining an actuality doesn't contain itself and does become radically anything one moment from the other, but that does not happen. The sun does rise in the morning. The cinnabar is always red, and not any red, but this red. Do you know that, like, for over 10,000 years, cinnabar has been sought from all parts and traded all over the world for its distinct hue that is identified across time and space? It is a mineral. And you know what defines this color? The geometrical patterns of this mineral. Plus, what that matter does to our sensibility, plus how we organize it in an experience. All of that together. The thing in itself phenomenalized, not binary split, not two worlds, but this. That's what Cinnabar is. It's a human relation, if you want to go to Levinas. In the beginning, it was a human relation, but also the human relation to the world itself, to the wholeness of the world. And that would include material consistencies that impress upon our own material consistencies, because we are necessary and lawful parts of nature. Okay, that's basically what Malabou said. Great. Okay, so you see like the pottery, right? The stone, like it is what it is. And we would sooner evolve. I mean, this is transcendental type of knowledge. You can take it or leave it. But like, we would sooner evolve before this molecular compound of cinnabar would ever change. And that would be why cinnabar changes, but we would never know it because we're evolving alongside it stably. It's the same world. It's the same one object. So all of this has like kind of scary questions that we need to like resolve. And I've been always suggesting that we are going to resolve it by finding again our necessity in the world. But some of these existential crises include: how do we avoid the pessimism of experience as a haphazard hallucination? Like, you know, like some matrix programmed by some, you know, evil devil figure that wants to fool you, you know, mess with you. Given that we do not experience reality in itself, unmediated, given that we form and translate it by our cognitive faculties a priori, how is the world knowable? Is our experience consistent at all with nature? Or should we doubt that utility, or should we doubt the utility of experience altogether? Why is the world of experience, why is the world or experience of it necessary at all? Either one, the world itself or the experience of it. Given that experience alone cannot show cause between objects of experience. That's Hume's problem, the billiard balls. Like, two instances just of the experience, fine, but that's not going beyond experience into metaphysics. That's why Hume doesn't really have a metaphysics at the end of the day.
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
This notion that the world can become anything.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that this is Kant or Meillassoux?
This is Meillassoux.
Ah, okay, I get it. All right.
Yeah, because Kant, not in the same way as the idealists, where like my reason is God's reason, is the reason ordering the universe. Not like that. But he is saying that that even if it's alien to how we phenomenalize it per se, that there has to be regularity, consistency, necessity, and causality. Because universal laws necessarily cause the form of self-consciousness or consciousness in general. The transcendental deduction shows that experience is itself a necessary cause in nature. I'm reading from my notes now. Something exists in the external world. He calls it the transcendental subject. It's whatever in us. We assume our body. He doesn't always really make that clear, but we assume it's something in our existence, something in our essence, as whatever being we are, as a thing in itself, noumenal, causes something else that also exists, which means that which that's the funny part. You're holding experience as both what you're looking through and the object. You're making an object of it in experience once again. You see the meta layer of it? It's like the idea, it's metacognition properly. And this is why I say it. This is metaphysics gone metapsychological. It's metaphysics gone metacognitive. It's metaphysics that thinks of itself as a conscious metaphysics. And the critique that would imply.
I'm very sorry. Don't let me interrupt. Is this a moment for questions, or are we? You tell me. I don't want to.
Let me read out this last part. And
Yeah,
then
go ahead,
I
please.
will let you. So here I say the transcendental I, thing in itself, is deduced as the objectively valid referent or correlate of causal necessity of the empirical I, the self as recognized as an object of spirit, of experience. Ergo, to review, a part of the external world, our body or unconscious mind, a thing in itself, right, has natural laws and causality, meaning, and this is the point, this is why this applies to more than just psychology. If this is true, this means that natural laws exist in general, that they exist really in the real world, because we're talking about something outside of experience, which means that the world actually exists in a necessary and lawful manner. Okay, what's up?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about this. Yeah, I see what you're saying. This is really cool. But it's not clear to me that noumena causes phenomena. Causation we can only know anything about causation within the phenomenal world. Yes, we know that there is this noumenal realm, which is the realm of the second critique. This is the realm of faith, morality, freedom, all those things that science can't really explain to us. So aren't we right back in the very tradition of metaphysics that Kant is revolutionizing by saying that there is this thing in the noumenal world that causes our like, maybe you could say that the mind phenomenalizes.
Well, then what do you think the
noumena,
transcendental
but
deduction is then? Do you not think the transcendental deduction is about a statement of causality, something that's necessary, and that has nothing to do with the world as it is in itself?
Well, you hit on this point that for Kant, I mean, the world emerges through the this synthesis of basically the mind and the external world. But we don't, in other words, we can't apply causality to noumena because we don't have access to it. Like it's beyond.
You're right in the direct. I think you're reading Kant before he makes his transcendental deduction, because you're
No, the transcendental deduction is there to, without the transcendental deduction, we are left in this kind of postmodern relativistic subjectivity in which, yes, our minds create the world, but
Chris,
as I said,
maybe we'll have to just come back to this, because you're just presenting a counter thesis to my thesis. What I'm saying is what the postmoderns think and what is incorrectly attributed as relativistic. This doubt with reality from Lacan all the way forward in the 50s, right? Like, it is completely in line with what Kant says. That problematized real.
This is where I'm. Yeah, I don't see it in Kant. In other words, I mean, the transcendental deduction is there to show that there is a transcendentally. In other words, that although our experience of the world, in other words, objects for Kant, we don't derive knowledge from objects. Objects are derived from our minds. And Kant, the transcendental deduction is there to show that
I think we're derailing.
We can't just.
I think you're wrong.
We all share this similar world. That is the transcendental deduction, is that yes, our minds produce and project and provide the coordinates of experience, but it can't be different. Your world can't be different from my world because of these transcendental structures built into the nature of the human, basically.
Right, which is a part of the natural world. So I'm not saying all the noumenal causes the phenomenon. I'm saying a part of the noumenal, which is called the transcendental subject because it's a priori to experience, which by definition makes it noumenal. And we already looked at the big diagram where every synthesis is within the noumenal thing in itself until the experience at the very end. So that means what we're talking about is noumenal. But you can
No,
only do
no, the critique
you know.
of pure reason is about the phenomenal world.
All right, I think we have to agree to disagree.
The noumenal comes in
my
the second
presentation.
critique. The critique of pure reason, I mean, he this is clear. He makes a distinction between, you know, the starry skies above and the moral law within. And the critique of pure reason is a critique of reason running through the phenomenal world. He's trying to, this is where he's overcoming Hume's skepticism, and this is where he's buttressing science.
Okay, in the third critique, he says explicitly, and I already referenced it, that what transcendental inquiry is in the first place is when reason goes beyond where experience can. It goes further than experience can.
Yeah.
Or the understanding can. So that means we're describing something in the noumenal world and saying something about it. And the transcendental deduction proves necessity. Well, I'm not going to argue with this, Chris, like all day. I need to finish my presentation. Sorry to say.
Okay, but what goes beyond experience are the deduction of the categories. In other words, our minds, when we experience an object, we're already providing. The synthesis has happened. For us to even notice this pen as an object, it's already happened. That's not the noumenal world. This is the phenomenal world.
Right, and Kant is taking the concepts and describing them as an object, but he realizes that they're not objects of experience, which is why they are grounds for a transcendental deduction to prove causality in the noumenal world. But anyway, if I can.
Sure.
Yeah. This is perfect to discuss after, of course. Anyway, Kant proves the necessity of the proper objective referent experience as the transcendental self. That is the noumenal object, the transcendental self. It's not what is given in experience, which is itself a part of nature and its laws, locating us not in some subjectivized matrix or some parallel universe, or in something less than even a dream, as he says in the Prolegomena. Rather, we necessarily mind the real, and we mind it under certain universal laws, which is why, as Chris says, we can all have a uniformity as humans and see the same world in the same way. Because we may build upon those concepts later. That's the epigenesis of pure reason, but we all start out with a bare minimum of certain pure concepts of the understanding, as Kant called them. For this concept strictly requires something. A should be of such a nature that something else, B, follows it from necessarily according to an absolute universal rule. Concepts which form the objective ground of the possibility of experience are for this very reason necessary. This is Kant in defense of what I've been presenting. Okay, so once we, that's it. That's the transcendental deduction. I mean, I've read it like 5 times. It's really one of the hardest things, I think, in philosophy to try to get around. It's what we read in preparation for this, so we can continue the conversation with Chris, and I'd like to hear from others about what was their understanding of the transcendental deduction. But that allows us, once we accept it, to make more deductions transcendentally, after like the big one, the first one that proves it, about the world. And that's the beginning of this type of metaphysics, a sort of middle path, as he calls it, between skepticism and rationalism. So it's the potential for the actual, the a priori condition of a possible existence, which would include experience. I entitled Transcendental all cognition, which is occupied not so much with the objects as with the mode of our cognition of objects, insofar as this mode of cognition is to be possible a priori, which means, once again, we're describing something noumenal, because it's, by definitionally, what is before and producing experience. Foucault's definition is the play of forms that anticipates all content insofar as they have already rendered them possible. So that has an ontological register where you can think in the widest sense ontologically, or in a minute sense, just the mind, the body, whatever you like. And for Malabou, importantly, it ensures the stability and the transformability of the whole. And it is true that in the a priori, that's where tomorrow's a priori is today. This is all from a book of Malabou called Before Tomorrow. So tomorrow's a priori is today, which means that there's something in the possible today that will transform tomorrow's possible. And you see this like recursively opening up possibility. So not a determinism. Once again, nothing to be afraid of in that sense. I don't think Levinas, Alex, ever does much more than revision and work with Kant. In no way is he departing from his ontology, however. We can talk more about that in just a second.
Could you, by the way, just on, is transcendental an ontological characteristic or a phenomenological experience?
No, this is the prior, yeah, the first one, the former. Okay, so this is the middle way, right, between dogmatism or rationalism, skepticism. Ergo, we cannot relinquish the real world or objects in themselves because we have discovered ourselves to truly be a part of it, even while apart. So, apart. This is an undecidability I'm trying to push and emphasize here. I do not thereby cognize according to what is in itself, but only according to what it is for me, that is, with respect to the world of which I am a part. So in Barad, this is a cutting together apart, the agential cut. Relata arise together in their relation. Or you have undecidability in Derrida. It's undecidable given this confound of ontology and epistemology. So let me read something quickly from Nancy. I was going to read something by Zizek as well. It's cool, but I think it's in the quotes page from last time. Nancy says, it is impossible to separate out from schema, you know, the concepts, the understanding, all of this, the reason's role, right, in the transcendental subject. It's impossible to separate out from schema an object called a schema. It brings along with it the whole of Kant's discourse. What is at stake is precisely this exhibition of theory's face-to-face encounter with itself and the exhausting, unbalancing question of the refinement of its discourse. To the two questions that summarize the two stages of his work, posed by Kant himself, are how to present philosophy and what holds up the system. We shall answer, taking a hasty shortcut, that Kant responds with undecidability. And remember the first part, the schema, like how we synthesize consciousness, which is properly a priori to it, forming it, is we're taking it as a concept, as something to be thought and experienced. So that's the doubling. That's the undecidable part. The apart, the hyphen. I'm going to leave it there. This is some info about how Kant got to France, and it's cool and whatever. Some Bergson, there's some Heidegger. Heidegger, importantly, is going to tell us that the noumenal is no doubt timeless only from the standpoint of a certain vulgar conception of time. This is Heidegger's sort of critique. It's like, well, we could have different temporalities maybe, or something like this. You know, how do we really know that it's timeless? It's so positivistic, right? Yeah. Real symbolized as the idea of real time or idealized time. That's it, pretty much. I recapitulate some of the biopower stuff I talked about at the beginning, and let us now hear more. Well, we're gonna have a discussion first, but let us now hear more from about Kant's role in French philosophy with a case study by Rabbi on Foucault. Thank you.
We should probably log out and log back in.
Yeah. I hope it was somewhat clear. I know the transcendental deductions, I'm still working with it. I think it's one of those things that you sort of always will be trying to work with. So, yeah. All right, I'll see you in a second.
The larger Kantian project, which I see Descartes doing this in the mind-body dualism, this distinction, is to, as he says, to limit knowledge to make room for faith. He is exploring, through this critique of reason, he's exploring the limits of reason, of knowledge. And we see that we, as Juan Carlos said, we get to a point where things, we don't have access to that, to the noumenal world in that way. And that then opens up the possibility of freedom. And because according to science and in the phenomenal world, we have causality is down, you know, there's causal determinism. Physics says that this happens, then this is going to happen, and you know. But so in other words, I mean, this is the two standpoints. We are causally determined. We live under determinism, and at the same time, we're free because we have a will. We have this, you know, this is the two worlds. So he's able to give the phenomenal world to science, because science is unbelievably powerful to explain these very mechanisms. But then there's this other world of all the, you know, love, all the, you know, freedom, faith, morality, all of these things that actually the scientists can't really, although maybe cognitivists are trying to do it, but you know, there is these anyway, that's all and I apologize for making such a thing.
No, it's okay.
I was just wondering, Andrea, that maybe there's kind of it sounded, at one point, it sounded as if like you were referring to noumena as like what's outside of experience, which is in a sense, that's true outside of like the manifold of experience, yes. But what's outside of experience in the sense of sense perception, I'm holding this glass of water, all the a prioris that allow our minds to see this as an object and as substance and positioned in space and time, that's not noumena. That's part of the, you know, the transcendental structures of the mind. You see,
which is noumenal. That's the point, because you're saying that there's something causally necessary determining the mind. Well, A causes B, and that A is something before experience. That really is the whole point. It's really quite simple.
But that's the thing, is I think causation is that we're back to Hume. If we take this notion of causation,
We're not back to Hume. We overcome Hume in this. We deal with Hume.
Is a category of the phenomenal world,
Or at least that's how Kant thinks he overcomes Hume. I agree with Andrea.
Yeah.
But that's his argument, that
that is the argument, right?
It's these intuitions and these categories that allow you to have access to the noumenal world through this transcendental subject, right? That's what Kant presented to the world. Like, I think that's his big contribution here. And he thinks that that's the way he can account for causality necessarily, against Hume's critique that you can at best have a constant conjunction formed by habit or custom than any necessary connection.
Yeah, and it's true that you'll never know something causally in experience. You'll have to develop a transcendental deduction independent of experience to know that.
Well, that's the a priori synthetic knowledge that Kant thinks he gives you access.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't agree with, actually. I don't think Kant delivers the way he says he does, but that's later, right? Like, that's the critique of Kant after Kant.
Yeah, and what I didn't get to show in my last two slides is that really we never leave Kant, whether you're in Hegel or Nietzsche or in Levinas or in Derrida. You know, Malabou, who was probably Derrida's most intimate student, certainly the only student he ever wrote a book with. She has characterized Derrida's work as in its entirety, being a deconstruction of the transcendental, an active engagement, and a never relinquishing of the transcendental.
I would add that for Deleuze, who emphasizes empiricism, he also doesn't let go of Kant, even though he'll declare Kant his enemy, and he'll grasp onto the transcendental. He says, after Kant, you cannot not address the transcendental, which is why his project is transcendental empiricism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Whenever we say the real, and we start using this, part of what my dissertation research right now is revealing that the real that we first start hearing of, like inciting Lacan for, it's actually used in the book we read together, 1945, 10 years before Lacan's first seminar. The phenomenology of perception. You go back further, you see that the real is being used in Bergson in the famous 1895 on the sur les données de la conscience, sur les données immédiates de la conscience, the immediate data or givens of consciousness. And here he's using the real and the imaginary. You go back further, and I'm seeing that as early as 1895, 1905, you see people referring to the real and the imaginary in a way that refers explicitly to Kant, not so much. Bergson is just rising. And so every time we say the real, yes, we can inflect it through Lacan, but this is one of the cornerstones, so as is the object and the other, to French philosophy in general. And this comes from Kant. It comes from the problematization of the real that Kant gave us, that undecidability of, we look through the schema, yet we're trying to describe the schema and figure that out. And what is the line? Where does the line begin and end between experience and where reason can transcend it? But not transcend it like detach, because that's transcendence. We don't want that. We're talking about transcendental, and that's like, it's very contiguous. And we don't know where the line is. And that's part of Foucault's work. It's like, we don't know where the line of finitude ever really is. We should never assume to. We shouldn't foreclose the future and the infinity of the future by assuming we know where lines of finitude are or where they're going to be tomorrow. That's the spirit of the Übermensch. Anyway, we'll see that in Robbie's presentation.
But the question of the real goes back to the Greeks. I mean, goes back before that. I mean, you have a strong sense of the real in Plato and in Aristotle, right? I mean, this is the history of metaphysics in some ways. But I see you're drawing a particular line.
It's the entanglement of epistemology and ontology. So the real is now this thing that we know is phenomenalized, that's barred, yet we're trying to negotiate with it. It's just like the unconscious, by the way. Like, we never touch the unconscious. You never touch an affect. You always negotiate across the line of conscious and conscious and perform a transcendental deduction of the symptom to explain what happened.
This is why I would say, and this is one of my questions to you, but why we could see the psychoanalytic unconscious as, I mean, as an analogy. There's an analogy somehow there with the noumenal world.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
it's dark. It's we know it's there, but we don't. It's not subject to time and space. It's not subject to the categories. It's
no philosopher cited more than Kant and Freud. And then second is Schopenhauer. And Kant, I mean, Freud says that his whole project really proceeds from Kant's critique of the subject. And it's just an extension of it. That's what metapsychology is.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote down a question. I mean, I like this turn, but your sort of thesis, I mean, I said, isn't metapsychology a neighborhood in the city of metaphysics? Because you said, I think that metaphysics is metapsychology, and I'm wondering, I mean, maybe that's just the obvious.
In a way, I feel like the natural conclusion of psychology dealing with transcendental philosophy is to become metapsychology. And you can say that about a lot of fields as they would approach, like, what would a transcendental anthropology be, a transcendental biology be? Like, what would they would have to be like meta-anthropology, meta-biology,
Why would there need to be a transcendental biology? I mean,
it would no longer be biology or anthropology, because these are defined as empirical sciences, and that would be metapsychology is not bound to empirical science. It moves past empirical science because it works with transcendental knowledge. That's the deduction, because you never touch the unconscious. You're never like really sure, actually. At the end of the day, but it doesn't mean that you should be nihilistic either. That's what's beautiful about Kant. That's his middle path. He stays with the tension. It's unresolved. It's undecidable. The frame is the object. The subject is the object, in a sense, when we think of it like the schema. That which we're trying to describe and deduce about, yet it's what we're seeing the whole problem through. The formal laws of our mind, whatever that is. And we don't attempt to like understand it in all its minute detail. I mean, Freud said we must be prepared to accept if we accept pre-conscious and conscious, prepared to accept just infinite layers of stratification between conscious and unconscious, all kind of unknowable and blocked and barred from each other in different ways. He says that, I don't know, somewhere in the metapsychology papers.
I think that my challenge with the transcendental is that it is a claim of identity prior to relationship. That it is, and it comes from this place where I find that to be highly problematic, and certainly given our conversations about Levinas, you could point to one voice that would say, why is that a problem? And part of the error, I think, occurs in this land in which epistemology and an ontology are being done together or at the same time, or kind of vaguely related to one another, is that you begin to forget when you use a word whether you're using it epistemologically or ontologically. And when we think of identity a priori to relationship, aka experience, we are confusing an epistemological term and observation with an ontological reality. And I think that I forgot her name, Edie, I think, when she talked about developmental process. In an evolutionary cosmos, in an evolutionary universe, the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, things come to be, they develop, they come to be in relationship to one another. So even the laws, like the laws of physics, are contingent, dependently originated laws that happen to come into play at this age and epoch of the cosmos itself, and as well as in our kind of plane of engagement with it. But it's different, and it will be different, and it has been different. And for those reasons, to mistake a law or an identity as existing in the ontological plane when they are really the epistemological observation of them, I think is where the confusion gets made, and then it leads down that path of the transcendental. I think you can go an imminent path and still achieve the same goals, but I think that would be my critique of it.
I think that's where they become.
I welcome Levinas's critique in that sense. More of a revision, if I may say so. Like Heidegger's revision or critique of not timelessness, but perhaps differential temporalities. And so you're absolutely right that like there's a question of Mitsein that must be accounted for, and how even the transcendental self comes to be. As Levinas says, there's a diachrony, the cut, that is instigated when we meet the other, because we don't meet the other simultaneously. And so what we experience of time is really set into motion through this juncture. But I would push back and wonder, like, yes, it's true that like it may be like the other may be innate. Firstly, at no point in the history of anything has there ever been individuals outside of groups or populations of some kind. So the other is always expected. The other is always coming first, and maybe we know it. It's foretold. And so in this sense, the other is innate. But even the necessity for the true other to arrive in experience, to even once again order our existence, even that need could be innate. And if the other never comes, that's how we're doomed, and we won't have a normal existence. It'll be a wounded, unactualized, I think, from its potentiality type of existence. So yeah, the question of Mitsein, I mean, the history of our Mitsein as beings, our essences, as they, it must include the other in some level. If there's any sort of archaic memory of what a self is, it would include the other. So I don't know. I'd love to hear from, I don't know, some maybe that hasn't spoken, or I don't know how you feel, Robbie, if you want to start soon, but.
I can, but I was kind of reserving myself, because I'll have plenty of time to speak. But Alex, your point was very provocative for me. I did quite like that. And one question I mean posed back to you, and I probably don't entirely understand, you know, your point, but is when you're going to from experience to transcendental, you're still using the word identity, and this is kind of a singularity, which I don't think would exist at that level. And because of that singularity, then there's not relationship. So it's kind of this individualism that then prohibits the relationality, which is what I'm getting from you, right? But I would almost kind of want to push that premise a little bit and ask if it's, because I don't think the words individual or singularity or identity would really be possible to apply. I think it's both without, but with relationality in a way. It's a relationality which isn't foreclosing the potential of other objects in the relation. That's my, I might be misreading this, you know, but I think there's something there then that can, and that kind of, you know, as Andrea took the question out of it and helps to get at what is the subject question here. I don't know if that makes sense. I really don't know if anything I'm going to say will make sense. So that's a previous foreclosure, but yeah, it's my reaction so far.
But I certainly agree that, like, for example, everything a priori that determines how I perceive space and time and all these things, like, it doesn't just happen in me by itself. Like, I agree with that this critique needs to be thought of seriously, but I don't think Levinas's critique of that destroys Kant. I think it just helps Kant grow and Kantianism grow. And at a certain point, you can let go of Kant, you know, if like your thing is truly like Lacan, Levinas, like you don't really need Kant at that point, but we should all be aware the Kantian ground we walk on, the Kantian real, the phenomenalized world. And it's just historically accurate, you know. Unless you're a Deleuzian Spinozist disavowing his Kantian mistress, we really can't make the argument otherwise. We're Aristotelian Kantians at some level. So I don't know. We're good? Should we?
Yeah, if we're good to go, I would like to get going though, because it's getting late.
Yes.
I would like to belch this out before I'm fatigued, and also finish it just to have a glass of whiskey soon. It's about that time, you know. So, but I mean, are there closing thoughts, or can I jump to a new ground we will explore together? Yeah, I'm seeing thumbs. But Chris's lips are perched, ready to probe. So, Paro.
No, I'm just okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
Well,
That was
Robbie,
good. Yeah. Oh, you know, Juan Carlos, you should do it's a very slim book. I'm reading it for the first time now. Deleuze's Kant's Faculties book.
It's wonderful. You'll love it.
You should do it.
Go, Robbie.
You should
go.
present it here if we're doing, you know.
We'll see.
I should read this book, yes.
Okay, so prepare yourselves. Andrea, would you put my slides? Do you mind? Are you able to do that? Such a thing? Great. Okay. So while Andrea's getting that, I'm just going to foreclose, I mean, quite a few things, I think, before I start using that word kind of ironically, intentionally, as we foreclose the transcendental. So, I mean, what I'm going to be talking about is what this means for anthropology. So I'm coming from a position where I'm currently being trained as an anthropologist. So I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm being trained as. So I'm in the process of learning that method and the value of it and the implications of it. And then I'm also here at EGS with you, for the past 6 months, which then kind of makes this whole presentation seem quite silly, as I'm the naive one that's not really going to entirely understand Kant. And this was definitely a challenging process, both in the sense of challenging. Andrea comes to me and they tell me, yes, well, experience is not everything. I said, well, you must be mad, because no, experience really is everything. I'm an anthropologist. I must tell you that experience is everything. So this was a very challenge. It was a defensive reaction upon first really diving into this. But I think it was a very productive one, because it showed me what lied beyond the experience, and both what that can do for this method, but also what that kind of means for anthropology. So I'm reducing myself quite intentionally. I'm very indebted to Andrea. I thank Andrea for this, and because they've provided most, if not all, of these readings, and have been a teacher the past 2 months on all of this material. And this was a very subjugating process, a consuming process, which really colonized the mind in a good way, a rare form of colonialization, and took over the past few weeks, especially leading up to this. So, and what I'm going to tell you is mostly the journey of this thought, and the conclusion I've drawn from comparing anthropology, Foucault, Heidegger, Butler, and Kant, basically, is my stomping ground here. And it's an opportunity to understand kind of some of the further implications of Kant, because Foucault was very much a Kantian, which I had no idea of, and here we are. I'm not going to really read entirely the quotes I'm going to put on the screen here, so I welcome you to read them as I go along, but they are there. So yes, we are going to start with Heidegger to see what philosophy thinks of anthropology. And Heidegger asks us to consider, what is anthropology's relationship to man? So is anthropology a brilliant, ingenious invention upon which we have a dumping ground of knowledge from perspectives of every discipline about what man means, and a deconstruction of it within anthropology, a kind of compendium, if you will? Or is it really just fooling itself? So anthropology is attempting to collate these perspectives, and as such, it must know all of and about man. Right? This is the idea. This is what the study of man must be. But there's a paradox to these conclusions, right? And it's that by studying man, we begin to think that we know man, but to what extent actually do we? Have we asked ourselves the question of what is man as just a sentence and a question in the first instance? And in fact, while man may appear in its ultimate possible richness within anthropology, we still know as little about man as ever. This is what Heidegger is saying, right? So do we even know what man is after all? So does this mean that anthropology has failed, or is there a lack that kind of begs for something more? So Heidegger is saying, we say we know man, but we actually have no idea what man even is. We know all these things about man, but we have no idea what man is still. So then what is anthropology actually doing? And this is the lack. The paradox leads to a lack here. So I think the good conclusion about what Heidegger is going to read out is going to say that anthropology is a discipline which exists within a particular region, a cut of the pie, if you will, of an infinite essence, a jiggly pie at that. It's ebbing back and forth a little bit, with a jello formation. It's flowing, and but it's still maintaining a shape, right, within a set conditions of possibility, bound to a particular ontic frame. So anthropology is kind of taking a particular ontic frame, but it's not really able to go beyond this jiggly pie. It's within there, and then everything that's beyond that pie is exactly what the man that is escaping anthropology. So anthropology knows a part of man, right? So we can go to the next slide, and then we get to Foucault. Reading Foucault more so against Kant, what I'm doing with that use of Heidegger here was just to show that there's a similar critique that will come from Foucault. So in a very simplistic introduction of Foucault's thought, we can just say, Foucault is interested in this life deep inside me. What is this deep sense I have that don't know but have, can sense but never really realized. And there's, Foucault's going to locate a transcendental. So there's this excess. It's lingering somewhere, but it's not able to be experienced, right? So for Foucault, because anthropology is taking as its object of study experience, which is already textured by a series of conditions of possibility, anthropology, or more accurately, ethnography here, will not be able to access the transcendental because it's within this ontic frame. It's not really going to touch the transcendental here. So in other words, because empirics exist in a pretextured place, empirics being experience, through conditions of possibility, they are unable to perform a critique which would access the transcendental as long as anthropology's foundation is based upon empiricism, because experience has already been foreclosed of the transcendental through epistemic regimes. So to access the transcendental, one must take an object, which we may not even call exclusively an object of study, which is not a priori foreclosed. And it's impossible for anthropology to do that. It will not happen. Experience can never be that. If anthropology only takes experience, it won't happen. And this is why you also have anthropologists now looking at literature, film, etc. Right? So Foucault's critique of anthropology is that it lacks this recognition, right? And in this lack, it often attempts to elevate the empirical to the transcendental. We get very proud of ourselves. We think we've done a cunning analysis of the human life and finitude in it, and then we say, "Oh, this is what this is the essence of life. Fantastic, we are done." No, but we kind of skipped a step there. There was a logical fallacy in the conclusion of anthropology. So the problem here, importantly, it's an anthropological point, but is in the conclusions of anthropology. So all of this is impossible, elevating the empirics to the transcendental, because it's already immediately foreclosed from the infinitude of the transcendental. Right. So for Foucault, why is experience immediately foreclosed in this way? How did we get here? It's really shit, right? We don't have many places left to go with that. It's very limiting. And this is the question I want to take on in this section. And then we're going to conclude with some, perhaps romanticized, but still optimistic enough, against Foucault's pessimism, on what reformations might be necessary and possible through kind of Butler and then returning to Kant after Butler. Yeah, so I think we can go to the next slide. And to take, Heidegger's question further, to answer the question of what the regional essence are that the experiential man engages with, Foucault is very famously, right, locating labor, life, and speech. And then there's a mechanization through labor, life, and speech of the transcendental reduction, which produces conditions of possibility, right? And this is the primary level of condition. So Foucault, it's important, I think, we don't often realize that for Foucault, there's a few layers of conditions of possibility which are going on. So it's exactly this transcendental reduction which enables the production of the conditions of possibility. And this next part is important because this is the mechanization for Foucault of the transcendental reduction, but it's hard for me to even grasp. So I welcome interventions. And for Foucault, the reduction is this, that positivist tools are produced to fulfill the desires of objective knowledge. And in doing so, there's a shift, right? That is from first, the conditions of possibility of the objects of experience and their identification with the conditions of possibility of experience itself. That is the existence of objects themselves, which through their own conditions of possibility may escape the conditions of possibility of the existence of experience itself. To, and this is the shift to, second, the conditions of possibility of experience being sought in the conditions of possibility of the object in its existence. So there's this foreclosure in combination. So whereby the object and the experience are conflated so that the experience is only possible insofar as that which it is within the object. So to Foucault, the mechanization of the transcendental reduction occurs when experience is foreclosed by the positivism of objects, which produces objective, air quote, unfortunately, knowledge. So this is my reading of Foucault's mechanization of the transcendental reduction. And again, I think this is incomplete, but this is coming from his quotes, and I think it's a starting point. And it's not really too essential for me yet, but let's see, it might come back and be problematic. So what's at stake here is the transcendental deduction, but also within three particular things he's calling upon. He's saying there's been a reduction of these things specifically, not just a transcendental reduction. It's very particular, and that's labor, life, and speech. And that goes from the transcendental to the objective to the positivist. So this is the first level of the conditions of possibility that I'm trying to locate here for Foucault. Yet Foucault also asks, how is this deduction reproduced? why does it keep happening? Are we just idiots and we want to repeat the same nightmare each day? But no, there's something a bit more that has to happen so that we don't just lose it overnight. The sun rises again. So how are these conditions, the primary conditions of possibility, reproduced? Well, this is where we get secondary conditions of possibility. And we can go to the next slide. So now we get to history, and I put secondary and tertiary conditions here. I don't entirely know if it's an accurate schematization. I think they really flow back and forth, but that's something we can also, I mean, is tertiality really super important? I'm not sure, but layering, that is, but they're mutually reinforcing. I see where you're going to end. Maybe we just leave and come back so I don't get stopped in the middle of this.
Yeah, that's good. I'll just close it and open it. We'll start on this slide in a second.
Okay. Did you? Okay, it's cool. Fun. Great. Okay, so where were we? Yeah. So Monsieur Michel has a transcendental deduction in labor, life, and speech. Okay. So then, how does this work? How is this reproduced? And, for Foucault, trained as a historian, yet barely given his history PhD, I guess, because they didn't like it. They said it was too radical of some sort. This is important, the history of it. And there was a history of human knowledge, right? That was both given to the empirical knowledge and prescribed its forms. Given and prescription, this is important, right? Because by giving, then we've reproduced. But because what is given is also prescribing in the future, then it is reified. So we give and reify, and we are stuck in an endless cyclical cycle, right? So there's a history that is both given to the empirical and prescribed its form, and then the empirical can be given to us, right? So now we're getting to us. That prescribed, how what was given to empirical knowledge can take form within the cognition. So, and this is why I kind of think cognition is tertiary, but I'm not entirely sure, because it's given to the empirical, and then the empirical is given to us, and then we cognitize, right? But I don't know if that's entirely fair. I think there might be a bit more. But so the prescription of form is here to maintain what was already given. So here for Foucault, through history, we can see that the historical a priori is exactly what comes before any experience, and its presence before this experience is the reproductive force in foreclosing any transcendental insights from the empirical in the present. So because it's given, we've already done a transcendental introduction, and now we're just reinforcing the transcendental introduction. And we're just permanently foreclosing any transcendental insights, or rather beyond the experience. So rather ironically, for Foucault, yet not in contradiction, the historical a priori works through the mind. And so Foucault says that for us to go beyond experience, we must return to the question of, does man really exist? So there's an important quote here. This quote I'll actually spend some time on. Foucault goes, to imagine for an instant. So, well, I have to save the recording one moment. Yes.
Where is this from?
This is a good question. Order of Things, chapter 7, the earlier reading prescription of Foucault that we had given. So to imagine for an instant. So first we're imagining, right? It's not tangible. It's an imagination. It's almost not real, but it could be real. We're imagining. Or maybe it couldn't be real. We're imagining. But we're doing it for an instant. So it's fleeting. It only happens temporally, instantaneously, and then it's gone. So we're imagining for an instant. We're going to come back to that kind of irreal temporality. What the world and thought and truth might be if man did not exist is considered to be merely indulgent in paradox. This is because we are so blinded by the recent manifestation of man that we can no longer remember a time. And it is not so long ago when the world, its order, and human beings existed, but man did not. So that was I read this one. This was big for me. Actually, not too long ago, man did not exist. That is fun. What do we do with that? It's important. So what Foucault's doing here is giving us this rhetorical question, a rhetorical statement, saying, imagine if man did not exist. But what he's doing with that is actually saying that whatever we think man is really an imagination of man. Because if there is a definition of man, we don't know it entirely. So any definition of man is actually an imaginary form. It's incomplete, it's contradictory, it's paradoxical. And what instead we should do is just say man should not exist. Out with it. So here, what is at stake is imagination that we're holding of man. And Foucault wants us to imagine things differently. I think he's very nihilistic in this sense, but we'll get there. The death of man. Yes. God is dead, and now man is dead. It's very sad. So, how do we have this take some form? What is the imagination, and what is the imagination doing? This is an equally important question to Heidegger, right? Because it's only through imagination that we can think that we know man, right? We don't actually know man. Our brain says we know man, and then suddenly we know man. That's an imagination. It's an imaginative reduction. But we actually have no idea what the hell man is. But if it is exactly imagination, which is a source of the conditions of possibility upon which life is built, is it not also imagination or a reconfiguration of which can breed new conditions of possibility? What I'm saying is that imagination is a source, the tertiary level, if I may, of conditions of possibility here. It's our conditions of possibility layer closest to experience itself. And the conditions of possibility now of experience, to me, is our imagination. So there's something after labor, life, and speech that is being done that reifies, which is imagination, which reifies the existence and conditions of possibility upon experience. So how do we think about maybe new conditions of possibility then? That would be fun. I mean, can we go beyond this nihilism of man is dead? Foucault does not really give us this directly. I think he's overly pessimistic, but Butler does. She does a better job here. And what they do is they'll go into the psyche, which Foucault had an allergy towards. So we have to return to Foucault's grandfather as well, Kant. And we're really only going to start to try to answer this question. My aim is, I mean, it's a bit selfish, and for that I'm seeking forgiveness, but I guess unapologetic. So because this is going to be a bit experimental where we're going with Butler and Kant, but my aim is to think with you here. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. But Butler takes us, to the level of the use of imagination within Foucault, which Foucault does not give us directly, right? So Butler says at the level of the conditions of possibility of historical a priori, rather than the transcendental deduction. So she's working with historical a priori, not transcendental deduction, which is important because she'll stop at a certain level because of that, right? So what they then do is, what might happen if we push Butler's connection of imagination of Foucault to a level of condition of possibility to its previous foreclosure upon the transcendental? What if we work backwards a bit more from where they took us? And this is the ideal speculatif is exactly what she's speaking to here. And it's through this ideal speculatif that they are pointing to us, how ambivalent or the subject is formed, subjugation. And it represents the limitations and possibilities. So the limitations of gender binary, but the possibilities of then pushing the gendered language within. And this requires an imagination to do. You cannot perform pushing conditions of possibility without this imagination. And then we go to the next slide. So Kant informs us that a productive I'm reading from the second quote first, and then I'm going to the top one. This was not intentional, but now I hope it can be seen as poetic because we're going up the layers of conditions of possibility. So there you go. So Kant informs us that a productive imagination is what is a priori, whereas a reproductive imagination is posteriori. Right? It's already the reproductive, texturized by the conditions of possibility. So, for example, the episteme of language or rhetoric reproduces a historical consciousness of American exceptionalism through subject pronouns, which continuously stress hyper-individualism. So this is reproductive, right? It's and we don't even know it's there. So in the first instance, we can see how imagination can be transcendental, however, because when it's productive, then there's a connection. And Kant is saying that this is a priori. So for Foucault, before he wrote Order of Things, he was talking about these psychiatries and these clinics, and within the clinic, he located the gaze, the clinical gaze, that is, reductively defined as the hegemonic episteme, which are given and reproduce form upon the body. So the gaze being these episteme, which are given historically a priori, passed down, and then enter the mind to create conditions of possibility of experience. So, Foucault, he knows it's there. He knows he's talking about imagination and psyche, but he doesn't like to use it because he's actually critiquing psyche. So maybe he would be called this contradictory if he did so. But on 4 pages of only 4 pages, a very tricky hiding little guy, of Birth of the Clinic, he speaks of a glance. So what is this glance? This is my interest here. I want to fetishize the glance intentionally to tease it out. And the glance is when all structures are dissolved, and the gaze is in disorder. So suddenly the conditions of possibility upon us are disordered. They're not, maybe they're still hegemonic, but they're kind of confused. And what happens when the leader is confused? It's like Trump's Twitter, right? Eventually you get banned. So, further, the glance goes straight to its object. So when matter affects the body, you get intuitions which lead to sensibility, Kant. And that is a priori. And that is before experience. So in that one gesture, the understanding is not applied to concepts yet, right? So you don't have a concept of what you are glancing at, with the object you're glancing at. You just have a sense and an intuition. This is why it's a priori. This is why the moment of the glance is a priori. So importantly here, let's recall that transcendental is able to be only when experience is undone. It is not curtailed and foreclosed by the conditions of possibility of the object itself into the conditions of possibility of experience. So here the transcendental is more accessible, yet not completely, of course, right? So can we say that the glance is transcendental? I said it was, but let's still, let's push it and let's see if it's there. So it's still something that is doing the looking. Something's doing the looking, right? But the subject has not looked yet. It's not the subject which is looking. Only the body and the soul are looking. So that is, it is in sense, but not perception. So the glance is an action of the body, yet not an experience of the body. And because it's not experience, then you have more accessibility in the moment of the glance to the transcendental, right? So the glance has a transcendental quality because it is not yet experienced and has not been entirely, but some inevitably foreclosed. But can the glance be the imaginative power which can breed new conditions of possibility? Let's get back to the question. We found the moments where, we can kind of get past a little bit of this, foreclosure of conditions of possibility. That's important to be able to push back. But now how would we actually push back if we're going to push back at all? So Foucault ends his, albeit brief, very brief reflections on the glance with the idea that the glance is of the non-verbal order of contact. So that is, it is beyond the original categories, or rather not one of them, speech, that has been transcendentally reduced. So again, we're outside of the conditions of possibility of it. A purely ideal contact, perhaps. Ideal. So desirable, possible, yet unsure if it could formalize. And hence perhaps, maybe it is possible. but we don't know. That is, the glance escapes our conditions of possibility of an object liberated from experience, that it can only be ideal. It is real, yet not able to be registered in the consciousness. It is the idea which can only unknowingly be sensed beneath the consciousness, but never fully quenched. Perhaps this ideal contacts within the glance is exactly the step before the imagination, before the concept of imagination is formed. This is the moment this is the a priori of the imagination, perhaps. So perhaps it is here that we might be able to push towards new transcendentals, new imaginative productions. This is what I'm kind of playing with, I'm getting very excited. Life is not over, Yeah, so now we have the next one, I think. So the next slide, that is. This is, but important point here, and this is, I think, why Foucault is so pessimistic and nihilistic about the whole situation. This is a fleeting moment. Immediately, the gaze will come back over the glance, always too strong in the media to allow anything to arise into cognition. Here Foucault becomes indecisive, perhaps melancholic, only to say, we must end man to begin philosophy. This is the conclusion. So for Foucault, the glance is not really enough. There is possibility, but the gaze is already too strong and too forceful. That there is no possibility left for the glance. Instead, we have to end man. Kind of sounds kind of dangerous. And I mean, if you also recall, biopolitics was at once very eugenical. So the glance helps us to identify a temporal difference between the power of the gaze and the glance, but does not liberate us from this power. That is, the foreclosure of the transcendental through layering into the conditions of possibility. We're not liberated from that. We still have that. So this is going on. And Foucault and Heidegger have told us that anthropology is worth nothing. Well, rather they say that we think we're worth too much. So my last point, will only be that Foucault's pessimism, perhaps, is because he did not engage enough with anthropology seriously, and perhaps to get the ideal to form an imagination which is able, in the moment of the glance, to then expand and push back against conditions of possibility. We can access new forms of transcendentalism, see even beyond a bit pushing conditions of possibility a little even more than formativity, might be by taking anthropology seriously. And so, yeah, the next final slide. To conclude, I'm going to be a bit disciplinary. I'm just going to say, his nihilism is not necessary, nor is this entire dismissal of anthropology. And if we put them together, then we can actually be a bit more politically productive. So this is a political, statement I'm kind of making. And I want to return, to anthropology with all these reflections. So it's worth noting that Foucault's exposure to anthropology was the colonial officer anthropologist and the suffering sloth anthropologist, which is a very bad politics. But there's been growth, I hope, in the past 50 years that parallels Foucault's idealism, I think about. In the first instance, there's this idea of radical alterity. That is, this is an ethnographic method, right? That is doing something that is almost, yet not entirely beyond the conditions of possibility. So, for example, if you take Spivak's subaltern, can the subaltern speak? If we go and find something that actually cannot speak, then perhaps that is, that is a radical alterity because it can't speak. So this is definition of radical. It's on the margins, so to say. But perhaps there is something really interesting that's happening. So it is that space which is conditions of possibility and the historical a priori simultaneously forcefully dominate in a totalizing fashion. Yet they leave open a gap where the glance can perhaps form an imagination. They become so dominant that they don't even need to be there anymore. And because they're not there, then perhaps there's room for action. Perhaps they weren't as powerful as I thought in the first instance, or they haven't rechecked their temporality. And then there's a moment where we can think of, by re-entering out of subalternity, perhaps there's a possibility to do something if it's re-entered in the right way. So we're still faced with this temporal problem. How can the fleeting of the glance overcome the endurance of the gaze, right? And maybe we can, not elevate empiricism to the level of transcendental, which is why, again, Foucault might be skeptical of the glance too. It's not transcendental enough, right? But what if we think across the empiricism and the transcendental, allowing them to inform and dialogue with each other and without attempting to fully ever represent one another? Because remember, after all, the problem with anthropology is not the method, but the limitations experience imposes upon analytic conclusions. So my anthropological proposition then is that if our experience is exactly what is foreclosed always, then let us understand the meaning of that experience, not to understand the transcendental, but to find moments of glancing, only available through likely deep ethnography, which might open up radically alternative ways of being in politics. So the word alternative here is not attempting to say any being or politics beyond the foreclosure of the transcendental within the conditions of possibility of life, labor, and speech. However, let us consider the materiality and mechanizations of the boundaries of these conditions of possibility, often easily revealed by the anthropological attention to paradoxes in our experience, which shows the gaps, the broken concrete, the holes in the wall of our conditions of possibility. And perhaps immediately there's a ray of light within that hole, which is catching our glance. And let us ultimately attempt to work to metamorphosize how the transcendental is deduced, and how this manifests in conditions of possibility, and certainly ever so subtle and transcendentally insignificant ways, transcendentally insignificant, yet simultaneously truly meaningful ways in our felt everyday social worlds, because we're blind ignorance after all. So for this, I stand by anthropology's continuous attunement to experience as an object of study, and all the limitations that come with the object. And I look forward to its ever-evolving analytic to address the gaps of our conditions of possibility. So I'm going to end on that really optimistic note. And that's also, I would say, I don't entirely agree with Andrea on one particular point of a transcendental philosophy would have to involve experience. Transcendental anthropology would have to involve experience, I think. Which Andrea said that it does not in the Q&A. I think it has to, because it's only by rooting in that experience can you actually see, what we need from the transcendental, perhaps. Perhaps that's too idealistic. Anyways, now I open it to answer questions. If I can answer any, I don't think I probably can, but yeah, play with that. There you go. Thanks.
That was great.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it.
Amazing.
What would be a transcendental anthropology? What would a transcendental anthropology look like?
My headset.
Well, I think Andrea mentioned something very different. I envision what I just pitched, I think. That last spiel, transcendentally insignificant, extremely significant for everyday lives. Yeah, there's a contradiction there, because it's not really transcendental. It's not the entirety of the transcendental, but it's a part of it.
Like, it's really stupid to speak of, like, in a sense, like, I have a chapter in my thesis called Transcendental Biology, Physics, and Psychology. But properly, these are all sciences. So it's a contradiction. What makes them sciences is their basis in empirical data and repeatability, falsifiability, etc., statistics. And so the calculable and the transcendental is precisely the incalculable. It's not what presents itself in the phenomenal. It's the residuum of the real. So anything transcendental would have to take up a sort of facsimile and an analog, an analogon. So when I quote unquote air quotes say something like transcendental biology, what I mean is a metaphysics of life. When I say a transcendental psychology, what I mean is a transcendental philosophy of the mind, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So transcendental anthropology would have to pick up with what Heidegger said. It's the region of the essence that's particular to man's being. And so I wrote something here like anthropology could, for example, produce new methodology that could produce different objects of study beyond empirical objects, so beyond experience. And so that would have to be something like alongside, and it would be beyond science proper. So it would have to break with science, like Freud did. Freud did not limit himself to the empirical.
But I think
He has a metaphysics.
the issue I have here,
The drive theory, and it's in
But physics doesn't. I mean, physics, theoretical physics. There's no there's no empiricism involved.
sure it is.
as
It's
well.
always about matter. It's always about matter. That's the difference between physics and geometry. Geometry is not about the world because that's completely virtual.
Well, not according to
Physics-
Kant. Kant would say that geometry is
Right.
the structures of space.
Well, I think that's where Kant is just a product of being too classical of a thinker scientifically. He didn't have the interventions we're going to have later. So that's how I think he misunderstands physics and geometry. Also, physics wasn't actually a science. This is a big question, actually, in the history of like 19th century stuff, or 18th century stuff. Is like Kant is dying at the moment that physics and biology are both emerging as sciences at all. Because before that, there was a Naturwissenschaft, and Natur was understood to be both organic and inorganic nature. There was no distinction. So some people like to say Naturwissenschaft is just physics. That's not really correct.
I think, I mean, if we want to go back to a philosophical anthropology, we have to be a bit more specific about what anthropology does. Because yes, it is based on empiricism experience, right? Fine, I will take that. But there's also a method, right? There's a reason we pose certain questions about experience. And the reason we're going to experience can be transcendentally informed. And how we analyze experience can also be transcendentally analytical and even broken from the experience entirely. It's not only writing about experience. This is the kind of the issue I have. So there's an analysis, there's a method, right? You kind of have to break down the research part of it. So, I mean, what if then your analysis is a priori synthesis of experience? And this is, I mean, this is the difference between the subject and the object of study. The object of study is the experience, and the subject can be, it's usually not about the other of which you study. It's usually about, I have two anthropologists here today. I've invited for backup. I should say backup, that's too much, but I mean, jump in as you please. But then the subject of study can be about many things, but it's not actually about experience. It's informed by experience. The same way it can be informed by transcendentality.
For example, you brought up the gaze and the potential for the gaze. I think just in the theorizing of the gaze, and that can be like by itself or in dialogue with actual ethnographic data. Like I said, it could produce like another kind of object that then comes into dialogue with the empirical objects. Like just thinking about something like the gaze, like what is the gaze? The glance. This like raw vision, before experience. And like Foucault, for example, in the Utopian Body, he talks about like recovering something like the glance, right? The mark making rituals and the act of sex, like especially in limit experiences. It's like LSD and Shark Valley in the 70s type stuff. But all of this to resist the gaze. The gaze is imposing conceptualization upon the glance. But yeah, both doing that as a praxis, but that's different. That's not really what I was saying. But that would alter the empirical method. But then alongside the empirical method, something like transcendental knowledge being made based on these themes, and they would be in dialogue with one another. And finally, the power of creation and like art, creation in general, to destroy structure. It's the erotic, right? Eros. It breaks apart the laws imposed by the death drive, by repetition. And so once again, ritual and dance, but then also like just relationships. We create something. I think we forget that we create something together. And this is what Freud calls the double transference. And in this, I think the glance and the gaze relationship can be revolutionized through this type of creating. and I bring this up in particular because ethnography historically is based on the development of human relations. And I think the most pure way to approach it, as I was informed by my first long-term partner who was studying anthropology, is you don't, ideally, in the most traditional way, you go to a culture and you let them teach you the language. You don't even know hello when you arrive. And you really integrate in the most natural way possible. And like, your only people in your life are those relationships with the people that are like slowly integrating you into the culture. It's real people. And there's something there's something on an ontic existential level is created. A Mitsein is formed like a bubble. That's what I mean by the double transference. And I think here, by the power of this creation, maybe you start to destroy the gaze in a way. I'm just musing this. That's all I'll say for the rest of this talk, but for this conversation. But just musing on what could the transcendental counterpart of the theme of the anthro, outside of the logos, the science of the empirical. That's it. Okay.
Yeah, I think your pure anthropology, it would be a bit different today with the ontic reinvention at the point. I'm with you.
How are we actually, this is I mean, I don't like these, you know, typical philosophy kind of things where, well, define your terms, but how are we really using the term transcendental here? It's not clear. I'm not sure. I mean, I know specifically in Kant what transcendental means. I mean, and it's not this.
It means beyond experience.
No.
Yes,
No.
100%. It means
the transcendental is not
as what is
beyond
a
experience.
priori to experience.
Metaphysics is everything beyond experience. Experience is the empirical reality. Metaphysics is beyond it. I think this is a problem because the transcendental means universal, necessary. The deduction, the transcendental deduction of the categories is a deduction to show that.
Why do you think I showed the Malabou video of the ideal? The ideal doesn't reveal itself. That universal law you're talking about never presents itself, yet it orders all presentation. Therefore, the universal law is noumenal and beyond experience. It's a priori to experience.
But a priori is not something.
I will never agree with you on that. Like, I'm sorry. To me, it's such a basic fact. And this is Malabou has said this over and over again. It's a definition. Transcendental is to think not the objects as they're given experience, but how they're given experience. What is that? How did that happen? How did it come about? What are those conditions? Which means that the transcendental is basically just synonymous with beyond experience.
No.
Yes, 100%.
Chris, I mean, I'm not.
No.
I would stake my entire academic.
I'm with
like
Andrea.
everything on that.
Granted, I learned these concepts from Andrea, but
you learned them from Kant too. We learned all of this together. Don't say that.
Like a quote or something here.
You read over 100 pages of the first critique.
Even if I recall where I've read of Kant, but maybe if you have a block of text or something to share, we can. I think this is a.
Sure, I'll go to the transcendental deduction.
But
I mean, this is an issue.
While you're looking that up, Chris, I think
the transcendental does mean going beyond. That's what transcendence. That's the term of transcendence. But transcendental in philosophical terminology means universal, necessary. So these categories are transcendental in the sense that we are all
Chris,
subject to
them. I perfectly understood you. What I'm saying is that we're not disagreeing. You think we're disagreeing, but what I'm saying is what I'm calling beyond experience is all the things you're saying. That's why it's the ideal that orders the presentations without presenting itself. Otherwise, we're in idealism, we're with Hegel, we're with Descartes. That's my point. These universal laws are beyond experience, yet they produce it.
Yeah, sure.
That's transcendental.
Sure. But I mean, beyond experience, I mean, that's what metaphysics is, beyond experience. That's precisely the definition.
Well, transcendental philosophy is it's like going backwards from experience, stepping beside yourself, behind yourself. This is what Foucault says in the last chapter of The Order of Things, in the section on psychoanalysis and ethnography. He says, we are stepping behind the culture that conditions us. We're stepping behind the subject that conditions the self's presentation to itself. We're trying to. That's why it's transcendental. There's a link between psychoanalysis and ethnography, in fact. And if you have to really go to Levi-Strauss to find it, I think. That's a sidebar for the anthropologists in the room.
Yeah, my Levi-Strauss reading seriously is coming the next year. I'm taking a gap year, just read books and be rogue.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Because I'm an anthropologist here. I would really like to say some stuff regarding what Robbie had said, but I don't want to intervene until I know what transcendental is. You know what I mean? Because what is the relationship of that universal and necessary that Kant is talking about? And I haven't read Kant. So I would like to understand that, and then its relationship to experience. And once I know, then I guess I can try to find a reading of Rob's presentation about the glance, for example. As somebody who has done anthropology, then I could maybe try to say something. But until I really know what that transcendental is, even if there are two different readings, then I can try to find a position vis-a-vis two different readings, or or takes on what that is. But like,
I would hazard. I would hazard to give a brief answer that you could give your reading off of, and I think it responds to Chris's comment to Andrea, which is, rather than calling the transcendental what's beyond experience, I think it's, from at least the presentation today, it conditions the possibility of experience. And that was what was so cool about Foucault's rendering of three, here's one way of looking at it. Here are three things that condition. I don't think Foucault was making a claim of universality or necessity. So I think we could use it in as broad of a sense of that which conditions the possibility of.
I would also
like the transcendental subject, sorry, is like where you would locate Rob's glance. For example, that raw of seeing, the transcendental subject, everything before, like all the cultural bias that you would unconsciously impose on your perceptions, all of that would be within the transcendental part of the subject before the experience and the consciousness really happens. Sorry, go. My bad. Just want to.
Let me make a little side point.
Sorry for
that. Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, the book in French is Les mots et les choses. The words and the things is probably a better translation because it's more faithful to Michel Foucault's kind of analysis of how there are discursive elements and non-discursive elements to analyzing things. So for example, when you're looking at the gaze or the glance, like in the medical sense with like the birth of the clinic, there's a discursive element in that the doctors are trained. If you see these symptoms, then discursively we give it this word, this analysis, like it's diagnoses, whereas the non-discursive element is the actual experiential, like what symptoms are you presenting?
I almost think of it as not just beyond that which is beyond experience, but that which is behind experience. And another thing, just with transcendental as being something that is both beyond and something that is universal. When I think of the transcendental deduction that Kant makes, in my mind, I always think of it as like a doubly transcendental deduction. The first part being the transcendental leap that allows it to go beyond, and sort of that's the part where Kant's really engaging with Hume and picking up these, as Andrea was talking about in their presentation, Hume identifies a lot of these things, and even the same parts that Kant's going to pick up, Hume just doesn't quite get there. So Kant is able to go beyond in that sense, and it's transcendental in that manner. But then also, to borrow phrase from a different Malabou presentation, but which I thought was really great. And I think this is her speaking. I don't think this is her quoting Kant, but she says, you know, okay, I must get beyond experience, but where to? And so then it's sort of that's the second layer of the transcendental for me, that it is, you know, reaching this space that is the universal, from which we can, the behind the experience, which we can then move out of. So this is brilliant transcendental deduction that of logic, of, you know, Kant saying, oh, Hume did such a good job, and Hume really thought it was ironclad, but I see a way through this as an argument. I see how the system can keep moving forward. And then Kant, in their genius, is able to get to that point of it, and this arrives us at a point of universality. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay, Zarota, give us your
Oh my, guys,
anthropological
now there's
analysis.
pressure's on somehow.
You have 5 minutes at least.
I have 5 minutes. Since I don't really know what transcendental is in theoretical terms, when Robbie had told me about this extract about the glance and the little bit that I know about Kant, it kind of almost, you know, anthropology works from the empirical to conceptual, then perhaps to theoretical, sometimes supporting itself with theory and working the other way down. But when you are in the field and you are observing things, your senses, as you know, never catch and you never really grasp the totality of reality, even though you're actually there in a place that you don't know, trying to familiarize yourself with everything, you know, through touch, through smell, through hearing, through talking, learning the language. It's a full exposure of senses, and you mobilize all your senses in order to try to understand this life out there that you're gonna then be digesting for the next few years, right? And yet there are moments which are the glance moments. There are plenty of moments whereby you feel like you're not present. You make a note later on, and turns out that something that you kind of like noted in the passing is actually, you know, containing within itself almost an explanation to everything else that you have observed. And these are passing moments, and we are not really trained to catch on those moments of the glance and give them value. And yet, you know, and so Foucault gives glance 4 pages, which is quite a lot in any book, right? It's a fleeting moment, but it's exactly the moment whereby a lot of the senses are not really present. So that was my understanding of it, whereby the transcendental is, you know, something is happening, but you're not fully grasping it with your logical kind of capacities, things that you were trained to do, I don't know, discursive kind of thinking. It's the withdrawal of all of those within which, and yet you're present somehow, but when everything else is somehow, you know, translucent, you're not really grasping everything. So that is an ethnographic experience, and these things are actually out there, not necessarily in the clinic, in, you know, in any situation where you go to in your life, you can imagine that. But it's, so that was my understanding of the transcendental, whereby actually we are somehow withdrawn from our experiences, and therefore able to grasp a moment or record a moment, but it's a fleeting moment which escapes, and takes a little bit of training to keep on recognizing them as valid. Whether the universal lies within that fleeting moment, I don't know. I'm just saying from the experience that sometimes those fleeting moments are actually the ones that I have learned had the biggest value for the observations that kind of, you know, for the pages and pages and pages of note taking. It's the fleeting moment of something that was, maybe I was half drunk or I don't know, tired from dancing, or in any other situation whereby I wasn't really anymore paying attention and something happened. So that I don't really have much to say other than it really speaks to the glance as an experience, right? Whereby you lose I don't know, give me some help here with vocabulary, Robbie.
I mean, I think what
You
your
know what
point
I'm
is
talking
about observation. It's not always.
No, but
about
you stop observing, right? There are moments where you stop observing.
When you retrospectively realize, right? You kind of. You
retrospectively realize that you've stopped observing, or you've stopped listening, or your eyes were closed. Yeah, and there are some little fleeting moments once in a while, where senses are somehow withdrawn or muted, to some extent. And within those, so whether it's beyond experience or prior to experience, or the experience as as a form of cognition through senses is withdrawn somehow or muted. There are moments like that in everybody's lives, right? Ethnographically speaking, I can testify that those moments are valid, more than I would have thought. That's all. So I don't know, any thoughts?
But it's not only the ethnographer, it can also be, because there's also, you've pointed out another fallacy in kind of the elevation of empiricism, the transcendental argument, in that, ethnography observes, it does not experience. The ethnographer does not write about experience, it writes about their observation of experience. That's very different, right? This is
there is a book
of anthropology, but it's.
But I don't want to talk about anthropology here. Exactly, anthropology is not meant to. I mean, there are schools of thought whereby experience is a valid. There are different ways of experiencing than describing, for example. So it is out there. There is a possibility of recording something, but how do you record a fleeting moment and a moment whereby senses are somehow withdrawn if this is exactly what's at stake, right? And therefore your discursive thinking is also somehow withdrawn potentially. A lot of the things that you are, with which you identify your bodily and your discursive epistemic kind of being, is somehow fleeing away for a moment, for example. And then in those moments, how do you then you record? And when you awaken to yourself again, what do you record? So I don't know if it's recordable.
It's like a dream.
Somehow, and yet it's not, right?
Or a trauma.
I mean, it can happen in many states. For example, entrenching yourself.
I'm not saying I'm not saying it happens in these states. I'm saying there's something similar between what you're describing and like a fainting or
I don't know. You guys take on from there.
It speaks to the undecidability as well, in a way. Maybe versus universal. I mean, I think the undecidability and universal are pitted against each other in the Heideggerian Hegelian approach. Andrea, you can modulate that. But so the undecidability then becomes really important, because it's not just transcendental undecidability, but it's capacity to realize transcendental, which takes place only within a space of undecidability. Which is, it sounds to me kind of I'm undecided of what
I have a parallel actually for the schema that Nancy brings out as undecidable for anthropology. I think that would be.
Can I give one parallel first?
The human capacity for culture and particular cultures. You know what I mean? Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I mean, Kafka was, the parable of the horse and the going away, and the slave, telling the slave to mount. This was Butler's seminar, telling the slave to mount the horse. The slave did not understand mounting the horse. So language is invalid. At which point then, where are you going on your horse, master? Well, I'm going away. Neither here nor there, just away. Undecidable, awayness. It's kind of really, so the undecidability does a lot. We have to find some link here with undecidability, the importance, and how to integrate that. If we really want to realize, I think the imaginative expansion of the condition of possibility, that has to be a core part of it somehow. Maybe that's actually that is radical alterity in a way, like the radical openness that's demanded, an undecidability through radical openness, ideological openness, mental openness, right? And the openness to any possibility. Maybe that's kind of a first step of a new colonization of mind. I don't know.
What I like about the undecidability instead of universality is that it does get back to that issue about whether we're making an epistemological or an ontological observation. Undecidability keeps it strictly within epistemology. But when we go beyond that to universality, that's where we start going back into making ontological claims rather than limiting ourselves within the limits of what reason can do.
Feeling inspired, folks. Yeah. Jay, do you want to bring in the parallel? Juan Carlos, there's been a lot of comments coming from you, which I think we would all appreciate to hear. Or Chris is perching your lips once more. I'm undecided of where to go next. Decide for me.
Okay, this is I'm still a little not confused, but it's as if, like, in an anthropological context, wouldn't the I mean, the idea that you go into another culture, for example, and it's, you know, observe experiences or something like this. I mean, isn't Kant saying that, actually, Roby, what you said with Kafka's short story, I mean, this is actually a big thing in Quine, in Donald Davidson, this idea of radical translation. In order to communicate with someone, even if you do not understand that language, there's the transcendental aspect is that you recognize that these are humans, that they have the capacity to use language. And so what I'm asking is, in anthropology, wouldn't the sort of transcendental, so to speak, happen much before you even approach the idea that you share this world with these other people? They're different from you, they might be the other, but you see that they are capable, they share the same transcendental ego. They, you know, their worlds might be, they might articulate or conceptualize their worlds differently, but we share this common thing. So the idea of research and experience of another culture, for Kant, like, the transcendental stuff has happened before that can even be possible. In other words, the transcendental categories make observation even possible. So what would be transcendental there is that even though these are others, you are assuming, or maybe not assuming, Kant would probably have an argument, but you're assuming that they are minds, there are beings, there are others, and they have these certain capacities, and that through experience, through time, then you can learn their language, then you can whatever. You can make observations, you can write about it. In other words, I guess my issue is that for Kant, like, we're talking literally about like experience in the sense of empirical feeling, touching, tasting this pen. In other words, like, the transcendental, all these syntheses are happening before we can even talk about this stuff. I don't know if that's clear, but I guess that's sort of mine.
That's why Foucault's wrong.
I want to highlight, you said before, that's all I really mean by beyond.
Before.
That's why I kept referring it to a priori. It's beyond in the sense that it's a priori.
Foucault's wrong because it's not an elevation of the empirical to the transcendental. He's taking the empirical, like you're saying, as this, right? I think that's correct. It's too reductive. And there needs to be a closer analysis there, which can lead him out of his own nihilism. But also, I mean, let's just, I mean, for a second, address what anthropology is. You know, we need to be a bit, if we really want to talk about anthropology, let's do it, you know, a bit more nuanced. And because, I mean, today, yes, it is approaching the other, but other insofar as we recognize positionality rather than view the object of study as the other. And similarly, I mean, pure anthropology, in Andrea's definition, I think that needs to be pushed on these concepts as well. But Chris, what I find valuable in what you said is, if it's before, then...
Well, before, I mean...
Yeah, but
this is
going back to
maybe heuristic. I mean,
and what's
there's
after is the retrospective, and you can only recognize the before in the retrospective. So you have the glance, of which you don't. It's almost like you don't recognize the transcendental. Then you're in it, but where am I? I don't know.
Well,
I'm away.
Well, that's
And
what's special about a dream, by the way. You have to reconstruct it upon waking. It's swimming in its own form. It takes form in conscious life when you wake. That's why it's
the retrospective.
nachträglich
Is that then in the
related.
gaze again? That would be my follow-up question. So
okay.
can we only recognize the
Well,
transcendental in the moment,
yeah,
retrospectively, reconstructively? Are
right.
we never actually going to touch it because we're in the gaze again?
What we're saying is spection is always retrospection. To see is always to see belatedly and to see constructively.
This is a great Hegelian insight, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm speaking of it, I guess, yeah, more through Freud and Kant, but yeah, they're all related in that sense. They all share this ontological ground, more or less.
Okay. With the glance, I guess my point, maybe this is helpful or not helpful. I know I'm not being helpful at all, but like with the glance,
you shake it up. It's very helpful.
What a glance itself is not transcendental. It's very particular. It's an individual. I glance here. It's what is transcendental here is the capacity to glance, and that is something that all of us as humans have. And this is what is the result of the deduction, is that we all, we can't not glance.
No, but the way that Foucault is defining glance is like, as Robbie says, like before you experience it or even see the thing. It's the glance would be at the level of sensibility before the intervention of the understanding. It would be like the transcendental imagination forming the apperception, but it has not yet been conceptualized through the concepts of the understanding, and therefore not given to experience yet. But it has been formed in one sense. It has passed through like one transcendental synthesis, so it's a product therein, but it is still a prior right to experience as such, and will be passed down to other syntheses that are transcendental. In this sense, the glance is not yet seen. It's unconscious, so to speak. It has not yet been retrospected to be seen. I guess I don't know how we play with that metaphor, but yeah,
But in order to have a glance, you have to have these forms of intuition. Like, in other words, the glance rests upon space and time.
Right, and intuitions have space and time. The space and time doesn't come from the understanding. And so this is like the imaginary in a way before the mirror, if you want. That's the way I would read it as well. But even before that, to a degree, because the understanding technically hasn't intervened to produce. Because what I'm saying is like, or what I think Foucault is saying is that the gaze is the retrospection upon a glance, and that if there's anything like a glance that's opening up, I would say it's still, as Heidegger is saying, like revealing itself to a degree, yet withdrawing also to a degree. Maybe it's a differential emergence of a thing. Maybe it's like Foucault always speaks of limit experience, but he doesn't say that he touches the thing itself. But the limit experiences are valuable, and this is why Freud is always thinking about the pathological, dreams, hypnosis, hysteria.
That was really interesting.
The contours of the normal. Sorry.
No, I apologize for you. The gaze is the retrospection. I mean that. But then we can only know the glance via that retrospection.
That's the tension. It's like fetishizing the glance a little bit, but it's like, because it's supposed to be what's barred, but yet somehow it reveals itself to a degree in certain moments of the limit experience. But I would say that Freud and Foucault would say that whatever can reveal itself to a degree from the unconscious, from wherever else, to a degree, and it it still will have to be translated at some level to be gazed upon. So the glance is it's a priori seeing. It's not seen yet, really.
And then we don't even know we're doing it. So maybe there is no hope,
Well, no, you were going. Go on. No, okay.
I think there is. There's a space of play between the two. You'll never have a pure glance, but there's a space of play, like between the two extremes. There's a field, and like you can. hopefully the creative aspect that I was pointing to, like the creativity, whether it's in art, ritual, relationships, love, like it can undo, restructure whatever structure is passing between the glance and the gaze. And so the glance is seen either more so or differently. Okay.
Always be solving tension. So we're always fucked, basically, trying to undo
Please,
it.
Dorota. I'm so sorry.
No, I was going to say that, you know, again, going back to the encounter with the other, it's exactly in the glance moments. I mean, there are plenty of others. They were not exactly glances, but let's stick to that. It is in those moments where you kind of lose the distinction between yourself and, you know, another culture, or the language doesn't matter. You know, all of this becomes unimportant, and you're just universally, you know, there. These are more of a moments, you know, before you rationalize, before the experience itself, before note taking, is when there is no distinction between cultures and languages and yourself and the other, right? I think that's the experience. I mean, being very conscious of it now, you know, post many years after. And after the analysis, I can tell you that the glance moments are the ones whereby you lose yourself within another culture more than any other moment, with all the understanding that comes after. That's all.
That's really beautiful, actually. Like, yeah, it brings me back to some inspiration and kind of makes me think that, Dorota, I mean, you and I at least can maybe experience something else, and then in philosophy.
My dear, I got lost so many times, but these are the most beautiful moments.
Right? Yeah, I mean, getting lost. Can you get lost in philosophy? Maybe we can turn it back on you all. You know, maybe we can say, you know, what's the point of what you're doing? What is the?
I do think that what people call like metaphysical insights, or like I touched the face of God in a metaphysical idea. I think this is like a glance onto reason itself. Like reason is getting a little bit of a glance of reason, and it freaks itself out. Ah! And this is what Spinoza calls like like God's love. It's like every time this happens, it's like your mind, which is a part of God's mind, internal to his mind, smiling back upon himself. So it's like God is like looking back upon himself, smiling. And that's an intellectual moment, a metaphysical moment. It's sort of a glance of like a very existential glance, you know.
Nice.
Well, you know, in the Enlightenment kind of era and culture that Kantianism is coming out of, the over emphasis on cognition, on intellect, on thought, on epistemology, to that universality issue is kind of the fundamental error. Like, you can lose yourself in the experience of another culture, another other. In particular, if you can put down the tool of epistemology and experience in a different register. And I think that, you know, if Kant, you know, has an error, it's that overarching embrace that was ascribed to what epistemology or philosophy can do, and a humbling of it would be helpful.
That's also, I mean, what I think that is really missing from these discussions about anthropology, because it is an epistemology, fair enough, but it's an epistemology which has an anti-politics against all other epistemologies. That is, it wants to, you know, a lot of the methodological words I'm using here, radical alterity, radical openness, and what I'm about to use in terms of arise in the everyday, are from Vina Das. I should probably warrant that in case everyone wants to take that further. But, you know, arising in the everyday. So sure, you know, but then isn't that a bit closer? And Andrea is very critical of me in terms of why I, you know, privilege anthropology, empiricism sometimes. No, you are critical, come on, in a reproductive way. But that is why, because there's an
Robbie likes to forget that I am also a cognitive scientist dealing with empirical data from the body. It's like, hello, I'm even
more rigid type of epistemology.
I'm even more empirical than you in a certain way.
You know, let it arise. It only arises once it's intervention. The intervention of anthropology is simply existence. I mean, just watching, right? The interviews are a different story, right? But just existence. So I think there's a different level here. That's why, you know. And Dorothy, I don't know if you, I'm not to put you on the spot here, but if I'm romanticizing the discipline too much. But you know, I think in the discipline this does happen. Like there is a romanticization.
Yes, you are romanticizing the discipline. It's not just watching.
Break it down. But
it's not just watching.
Always, you know, romanticize it in that way. Maybe that's a reifying kind of feature to get me to, you know, do further graduate training in anthropology. I don't know, but
you know how there is this schema doubling, undecidable and non-C. It's like what we're trying to deduce and explain transcendental, but it's that which transcendentally produces experience itself. So it's a tautology. In the same way, it's like, how does the cultured being, I have a culture, go and step into another culture, but then there's another undecidable part as frame and object. It's like, well, are we really describing man as such, and man with culture, the cultured man, human, right? Or does the anthropologist say, well, I specialize in this culture though, so I'm going to go study a culture, a human culture. So like I think I kind of mentioned this, right? The particular and the capacity for the possibility for any culture, and then right, like the empirically actually programmed culture received by that capacity, which was a possibility conditioned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I see like a few ways that like anthropology has a transcendental base and could tap into it in a way, like following Foucault really to the T, by dealing with these two undecidable things, like that first, that I have to describe something that enables me to even see it. Like part of my perception is culture. I have culture, a culture, or maybe a couple, whatever, but then I'm seeing another culture.
But isn't that the work of, you know, the job of artists to do that more than anthropologists, right? It's to describe the scene, describe what you have seen as the one that presents itself to you through your senses, whereby you're not really meant to describe the metaphysical.
Well, my undergrad was in art, and I dropped out of a master's in fine art. And
no, but I wonder whether that
we always project in art. We always create a future, I think, and we dream. Like that's it. Like it's just like, what do you want the world to be? So
you don't really ascribe transcendental, you know, experience, potentiality of transcendental experience, if the
metaphysics
is about, and like that is not really, that's beyond experience. So you're not supposed. Is that relationship between experience? I'm not even sure if I'm using transcendental in the right terms here, right? Because I only deal with experience. So what I'm trying to tease out, what is the relationship of transcendental to the experience? Whether some of you say that it enables it, some of it, you know, some argue that it's beyond or before, or it's kind of withdrawn from experience. I'm trying to figure out where it sits and what kind of brings out in us that capacity to, you know, transcend, and transcend in what ways, where, when, how, in what moments. You know, these are the kind of, you know, I'm just listening to all of you. I'm trying to figure this one out in my head. And I'm learning, because I only deal with experience, not with transcendental. Even if I recognize in my experiences transcendental moments, then, you know, then I'm trying, okay, oh, that may have been transcendental. That's, you know, only after a reflection. Oh, that was a weird one. What was that? You know? But because it's in your vocabulary.
I'll comment on that I think that in this chat and in these conversations, different philosophers articulate transcendental as a concept in their own nuanced way. And then here we have been confusing at times what is transcendental with what is transcendent, which falls in the world of transcendence. That's like God that is beyond the world, sometimes playing a part in the world. Like in terms of the transcendental, it wouldn't allow for that God. Kant, in one specific way, is looking at the conditions for the possibility of experience, right? So a priori intuitions and categories that you must have. So space and time is always intuited, even if you don't ever know how space-time actually manifests objects. Deleuze's criticism of Kant is that he didn't go towards a genetic explanation of the given, of what is given. He only looked at and considered the possibilities of that. And so if you look at a genetic explanation, you would get into a more empirical sense because you're actually articulating how the given comes to be. And for Deleuze, it would always be in a process of becoming. Being for Deleuze is becoming. But for Foucault, I think the other project, and it's exemplified with, for example, his project as to the concept of man. Like his general process is to historicize, that's why he considered himself a historian of systems of thought, to historicize how the transcendental is manifested. So when he analyzed how man is created, he looked at the discourses that defined man and explored man as a scientific subject, as the subject of the gaze, the docile body. And he therefore declared the death of man, saying, this does not define what we are, who we are, etc. Instead, he proposed towards the end of his works the concept of biopowers, which emphasized that in reality, what is happening is we're not dealing with one man, but we're dealing with populations. How biopower manifests itself over populations. And so he didn't see man in isolation. He started looking at groups of people, populations, and nation states, whatever, which is, I think, very different analysis altogether.
Juan Carlos, I love that. And my question would be, you know, if Foucault is kind of historicizing this, looking at, you know, I mean, is it, in other words, isn't Foucault against the transcendental in a sense? I mean, if we take the transcendental as this kind of, I mean, the idea of something being transcendental is that it's universal, necessary, it's, you know, it's there irrespective of what you think about it. And if Foucault is saying, well, those are transcendentals, our conditions of experience evolve, change over time. This is also a Hegelian insight probably as well. Isn't that contrary to the whole notion of the transcendental in some sense?
I think that's.
I think that's the dominant reading of Kant. I think that's the dominant, it's not the only reading of Kant.
Well,
Yeah.
Kant is definitely saying that it's universal and necessary, but that's not necessarily to say that the word transcendental can't be limited in a more narrow sense to mean that which conditions the possibility of, which means that transcendental could legitimately be used in a way that does not connect to necessity. And in the three, the labor, logos, life, I can't remember the triad that Foucault used, but those were three transcendentals put forward as a way of experiencing and engaging with the phenomena. And it's really interesting to kind of conditioning ability component. And Kant maybe, but it's not necessarily so.
This is something that Andrea and I have been kind of talking about, is the idea of, I think it connects, I don't understand. Apparently I wrote something and it was very insightful. I had no idea it was important. This is how I guess I navigate philosophy, but it's fun that way. So I was saying, you know, labor, life, and speech exactly are different types of, not even transcendentals, but essence of. Now, the question of, is the transcendental universal? I don't entirely. I mean, I guess by my understanding, what I would say is we don't know, and we'll never be able to know. Sure, there might be a universal, but it's impossible to realize or know.
My only pushback was not on that part, by the way, not just merely the universal part. My pushback was on the part that like it never changes nor evolves.
Oh yeah,
because Chris was saying that that's maybe more of a Hegelian like reworking, and I agree it's an unpopular reading of Kant, but I think
the essence
you can find
the point
moments where the pure concepts instigate the potentiality for all kinds of concepts to like form thereafter. There's a plasticity there, and Kant calls it the epigenesis of pure reason, and the epigenesis of the categories, and then he comes back to epigenesis as a theme in the third critique when he tries to displace judgment from the transcendental subject to something like a transcendental body. Doesn't quite articulate it that way, but then Merleau-Ponty will.
But there's the point then is that, I mean, I'm trying to take forward what Alex is saying a little bit. I mean, the point is about the essence to me, because then labor, life, and speech are three. I don't entirely understand Heidegger yet. Chris,
essence like with a T.
Sure, essence with a T, whatever that means, you know. But in that sense, and then what I think is important and what is interesting is then those essence somehow collect and maintain power, which is what Foucault realizes. Juan Carlos, I agree with you. I mean, I would say Foucault's work is about how subjugation is performed, how man comes into being, which happens through power and forecloses man. I think Foucault's work is about foreclosure. And biopower and population, I don't think he's doing population because he thinks there's like a collective essence. I think he's doing population out of nihilism because there's no possibility for individuality or even subjectivity beyond how we've been subjugated. So now we can look at it beyond the subject to the population because there's no possibility of transcendental subject left. So now, you know, how is everything else going on?
So I don't know that Foucault totally believed that, and his last books were supposed to explain his idea of a subject or subjectivity, but then he died. But his work was going towards that, like in the last volumes of...
He explains subjectivity in the prison. Butler talks about this as well, the prison, and how the soul is actually what traps the body. And the soul itself is a type of prison. The soul becomes subjugated, which forms the prison of the body.
Right, which is why you create docile bodies. Those are, for Foucault, the processes of subjectivation.
Yeah. No, the soul is before subjectivization. That's the point Robbie's trying to make, though. That's a priori.
Well, that's what's being subjectified, right, to the power and knowledge dynamics.
Sure, but that's his starting point, is my point. We start there. We don't start at populations. We end up at populations because his starting point of what he desires.
Let me give you an example of what I mean, right? And this is in Discipline and Punishment.
Technological apparatus, and that we're constantly recording everything, but I have not gone back to anything ever.
But it's recorded regardless.
Eventually, we'll have to look at some of the videos.
Yeah, just spy on ourselves. That's my resolve. I don't know.
May I finish my point real quickly about Foucault and Discipline and Punishment? If I say that Foucault cared about biopower, and biopower is a concept he develops later on, right, in the first volume of History of Sexuality. So when he was writing Discipline and Punishment, he hadn't conceptualized biopower in a concept like biopower, but he was already thinking about it. So if you look at the prison, he cites Jeremy Bentham's panopticon as what I would say is a transcendental element insofar as it's a strategy that was implemented on prisoners, plural, the prison population, to self-police themselves, self-regulate themselves. The prisoners became afraid that in this random circling panopticon, they were being surveillanced and would be punished if they violated rules. So they self-regulated and complied with the rules. They became docile bodies through this mechanized system of power over them, the panopticon, right? And so when we're talking about the like the discursive element in the prison setting, we're talking about how do we achieve that form of docility in the prisoners.
But can you define biopower for you? What exactly you mean by it? I mean, there's a standard definition, which I'm happy to say, but I'm not entirely sure what you mean by it.
So for me, or I mean, I have to look at it again, but I mean, just breaking down the word, right? Foucault talks about bio as the biology, like the biological entities, which could be humans, in terms of a human population, and how do you subject power over that human population? Like that's what he's talking about, biopower. And his argument would be through processes of subjectivation, which do fall into these created epistemes, right? This form of knowledge and power to condition the process of whatever you are defining. It could be a prison population, for example.
No, there's a tension here, I think. I mean, to me, and others can correct me here, but I'm pretty certain that, you know, it's very explicit in Foucault that biopower is making live and letting die. So it's actually, there's a Zoe here. Finn has given me a rock star cigarette beanie. I love
those are characteristics.
I really appreciated Finn's video. It's been really nice for me. What was it, Juan Carlos? I'm really clear that's the definition. Because subjugation, you don't have to let die in subjugation. You don't always let die, nor do you always make live in subjugation. You kind of set the historical a priori for it.
I would say that those are the...
And it's that specific framing which Mbembe then switches around and it draws necropole.
But what's at stake, I mean, Juan Carlos, I think there's a tension I have with what you're saying in terms of population versus individual and subjectivity. But maybe we also shouldn't think of Foucault's subjectivity as an individual process. I think it can go beyond individualism. I think he was kind of embounded in individualism, but not entirely.
What you're saying that's a manifestation of biopower, right? If the state has control or has the ultimate decision over life and death, then that is a manifestation of biopower, right?
Yeah, but the prison is not making live.
It's not the definition of biopower, it's a manifestation of biopower is what I'm saying.
What do you mean by manifest? I mean, what does manifest mean?
It's an example of biopower. Like the death penalty, for example, is an example of biopower.
Well, that's an example of necropolitics.
I mean, necropolitics is like a subset of biopower, right? Like biopower and biopolitics, you're just emphasizing the politics over death versus the politics over life.
It's letting die, not making die. It's making live.
Isn't it, it seems to me that, okay, biopower, that's one thing. But if we take Foucault sort of project, and I mean, isn't he looking at all of these kind of whatever institutions, all of these things that are recognized by us as whatever natural, traditional, this sort of whole universal, all of these things, and he's showing, or scientific or whatever it may be, and he's showing that, actually this science of psychology, if you trace back its genealogy, its origins are not this kind of, reason asserting itself in the, intellectual autonomy of, the Enlightenment thought. Rather, it emerges out of absolute, power and, subjugation and, these sorts of things. The precursor to the insane asylum is, this kind of mad whorehouse or whatever, however he does it, right? So in other words, with biopower, we can look at Aristotle, and isn't his virtue ethics, isn't that a sense of biopower in a way? Biopower maybe has always been there, but I think Foucault's point is that in terms of an episteme, in terms of a way of a conceptual framework which shift through time historically, that we are in a biopower sort of episteme, for example, now. And we can always see the roots, but it has now flourished. It's now a discourse. We have Agamben, we have a whole thing. And of course we can trace its sort of genealogy in a way, but, or Robbie, you mentioned essences. Well, the idea of an essence has changed over time very much. And there's a whole line of thinking that denies the idea of essence, right? So isn't that the idea, which goes, my larger point is that it goes against Kantian Kant's system in the sense, because Kant, I'm not defending Kant, but Kant he says that this shit is universal. Like, this is, we all create our worlds, but we have to create it in this way.
So I mean, I think my point
Foucault is
like,
the whole Derrida. I mean, deconstruction is a way of deconstructing these kind of the rigidity of our traditions in a way, which are ideological because we don't see the gaps, right? The ideology smooths over the gaps in these systems.
my point, I mean, is that my presentation was explicitly political in looking and attempting to identify ways of how we expand the conditions of possibility. And the reason it became political was because Andrea necessitated me in not in non-resentful way here. I appreciate it very much. It was very productive to read not from the bottom up, which is what I'm trained to do, experience, right? Then what is that about? What is the experience about? But from the top down of the transcendental, down, and going down, then looking at closure.
Corporate strategy.
Yeah, I mean, there's an irony there, right? Because it's exactly the opposite in a way. But it's, so, and then looking at the foreclosure of each of those levels. And the reason I'm kind of pushing back a little bit, Juan Carlos, is I think first, Foucault does start from the subject. It is the subject in the clinic and his frustration. We can make this very personal. Foucault's gayness, I think, is a huge driving personalized force and how he has been medicalized, and even HIV in his death, right? And it comes from this displaced subjectivity, which is because there's a foreclosed transcendental subject. And then, yes, he gets to biopower, etc. But also maybe, I mean, there's on the first 10, yes, it's about population, it's about numerous individuals. But to me, what I'm really looking to do here is point out the value of looking at his idea of subject. Because in his idea of transcendental subject, then the distinction between individual and population becomes very, arbitrary almost. I mean, it's only in his later analysis. I mean, so I guess what I'm proposing is I've found a ton of new value in going to earlier Foucault and looking at this later Foucault. Is yes, we can talk about biopower, we can talk about make, live, and let die, we can talk about necropower if we want. But what I don't entirely understand, because then it loses the nuance. There's actually a nuance to this type of philosophy. There's to use the word, individualizing or subjectivizing, a kind of location of it, which is a lot more powerful in producing a politics than would be just looking at biopower and necropower, which has ultimately led to a often futile anti-politics, the US case one. So I'm looking for a political perspective here, and this is why I'm pushing back, because this perspective of biopower and coming at Foucault backwards, which is how I started with Foucault, is, and you need to start with Foucault that way, I think, because that's the only part of Foucault that's actually tangible to a lot of people. But going actually now through Foucault forwards is a lot more useful politically, because it shows more of the openings than the foreclosure, right? So, yeah.
I personally like where you're taking Foucault. I think before he died, that's where he himself was heading.
Technology to the self was next, right?
Well, because I think what he started to explore was how can we create our own subjectivity that resists biopower, that resists these mechanisms of control. And so I think but for me, because Foucault's project was abruptly ended through his death, I pick up these questions with Deleuze and Guattari, because I think that they are able to articulate a form of creating your own processes of what they call becoming that are resistant to these forms of power.
Can you tell us about those? Can you inspire us?
What's that?
Can you inspire us with those becoming technologies? Which sounds like the technology itself. I mean,
well, you can always, for example, in the postscript of Societies of Control, Deleuze, in a way, talks about how his work and Foucault's work coincide on these questions. And he explores how, for example, he argues that we're individuals, not individuals, but individuals, because we're so individuated societally. But nevertheless, it's about exploring ways of resisting despite that.
Yeah, that's what's at stake.
There's a great friend. Go ahead, Dorothy.
No, I mean, how did you guys move from transcendental to biopower? Because that was a kind of a jump.
I said here in the chat, biopower modifies the body, which is transcendental in relation to the subject.
Wasn't Foucault influenced by Althusser's interpolation to some extent?
Yes.
Right, and wasn't that, and that also was explored in different ways though, but wasn't there an element in the fact that we kind of to some extent become subjects or love to be subjects or want to be subject, and there is a certain inescapability of that?
Yeah, of course. Foucault depends on Lacan's like symbolic structure, and that's where this whole like ability to be interpolated at all comes about. I mean, you have to have a mirror concept of yourself to be interpolated, first of all. So that's beyond the mirror stage. Mirror state is very important for Foucault. It's in the beginning and end of his work.
And that's transcendental.
Sure, what is transcendental is the ability to be interpolated, the capacity, and that is defined by the assumption of the symbolic order.
Which comes back to the fact that you need to be with the other of sorts.
Yeah.
Always, okay.
Yeah, I think it's both innate in the subject and also like is part of the structure inherited of all, like whether it's culture, linguistic. I mean, that's kind of the same.
So the cognition, I'm saying kind of recognition of oneself always happens, whether it's a subject or with big S or small s, you know, whichever other big O or small o, is only ever possible through an experience and recognition of oneself, some kind of interpolation. Linguistic,
the interpolative experience,
vocal.
yes.
Yeah,
Because you're called as something, as an object, and you realize you're being called as that object. So you both people there's an IU dialogue, but both people are holding one of those people as a third person, and they both understand it simultaneously.
Where
that's
does this
that's a step beyond like just normal experience of like a 2-year-old, right?
Yeah, but there was an element of I mean, maybe I'm shifting here, but somehow I'm still interested in that video that you played about the death mask, right?
Mm.
And that was quite interesting. And something that comes to mind, and I'm not very clear in what that means, this idea of a schemes, how do you pronounce
schema.
it? Schema. Can you kind of try to explain whether that's relevant to the conversation or not?
I mean, to really make it simple, and this is not entirely true, we can just relate it to concepts in general. I mean, technically, I think she is talking about the sensibility. So technically there's no concepts in the sensibility, but the counterpart is basically like their schema, and that's applying spatial form to sensory information.
Are we always responding to the other, or are we responding to the schema, I guess, as well? Right?
Maybe the schema responds to the other, insofar as it can transform, or was born in a situation of mid-sign from the very beginning. Mid-sign is a being together. Sorry, it just means that we are together, and that our being for ourselves must inherently be connected, if not structured, if not preceded by a being together.
This is an oversimplification, but think of the difference between form and content.
Mm-hmm,
in a way. Mm-hmm. You need a schema in order to see this as an object, right? Like you need this conceptual sort of apparatus in order to make sense of something.
Yeah.
Right. You need a theater in order to. You first need the theater building in order, and other sort of transcendental structures there before you can fill it with an audience and a play. enact.
Yeah, so is schema somewhat that beyond that before experience?
Yes.
Well, that's what I'm asking.
It's like, for example, if you open Maya on your computer, which is, you know, the 3D modeling program, and so like you open it, that's like what the schema provides. It's like before the schema, there wasn't even the space at all. So you open it, you see like all these 3D coordinates, and now suddenly an object can make sense within those 3D coordinates.
So then is Kant connecting schema to the transcendental in any way, or is that somebody else's conversation?
Yeah. I mean, the application of the schema would be a transcendental synthesis producing experience.
And we didn't talk about it.
Kind of, yeah. Well, it's hard to talk about it all. Yeah.
That's interesting, no? Okay.
The more I say it, the more I can simplify it, I guess. And that's at the end of the conversation. I don't know.
Butler talked about, I mean, this idea of schema and just, I mean, implication of technologies upon the subject of it. I'd like to read, I mean, I opened the text. I would like to read her. I think they're doing a really interesting thing, this paradox of subjugation, and saying that the only reason any idea of the subject is possible, or the reason that the subject is possible, is because it mandates subjugation. So without subjugation, there'd be no subject, basically. And it's coming from a place of ontological undecidability. So if we don't mind, I mean, at a 40-second reading, you know, the turn, and the turn being, this is Butler's psychic like a power. The turn being the turn of the subject backed upon the power to push back on power. The turn appears to function as a tropological inauguration of the subject, a founding moment whose ontological status remains permanently uncertain. Such a notion then appears difficult, if not impossible, to incorporate into the account of the subject formation. What or who is said to turn, and what is the object of such a turn? So they're one and the same. The subject is only possible because subjugation is existing, and subjugation only exists because there's a subject. Basically, they're coming from the same ontic place. How is it that a subject is wrought from such an ontologically uncertain form of twisting? It's an ontic place, but it's uncertain what that ontic is. Perhaps with the advent of this figure, we are no longer in the business of giving an account of the formation of the subject, which is what Foucault does. We are rather confronted with a tropological presumption made by any such explanation, one that facilitates the explanation but also marks its limit. The moment we seek to determine how power produces its subject, this is going against schema. How the subject takes in the power by which it is inaugurated, we seem to enter the topological quandary. We cannot presume a subject to perform an internalization if the formation of the subject is in need of explanation. The figure of which we refer has not yet acquired existence. We don't even exist, and is not part of a verifiable explanation. Yet our reference continues to make a certain kind of sense. The paradox of subjection implies a paradox of referentiality, namely that we must refer to what does not yet exist. A few pages later, let us consider that a subject is not only formed in subordination, but that subordination provides the subject's continuing condition of possibility. And finally, the subject is produced through foreclosure. So we're foreclosing uncertainty. And that's what I'm going. So I don't know. I'm looking for the politics here. And it seems like it's about openness and not intervention and these types of things. Because I'm just kind of, I'm a little hesitant on schema, because then we go to schema, then it seems like it's going to structure an intervention again. The whole point is not radical openness, anthropology. Yeah. Okay.
Robert, what were the pages for that?
That was amazing.
Psychic Power, pages 4, 7, and 8. Yeah.
And sorry, it was what writing?
Psychic Life of Power, Butler.
Groovy.
Starting from page 3 into page 4, 8 and 9. Excuse me. There you go.
Thanks.
Should just one person go next time? Is this too overwhelming? I mean, I've had fun, but it's like 4 hours or so. And because I'm just trying to think next time. I think Alex might want to, if he has the time, I don't know, with work, but I don't know if you'd like to go alone and maybe we keep this shorter, or if she would prefer the support and we keep it longer. The good thing about working in a group is that your readings are kind of related, so you kind of like study together a little bit was brought in our lives for a while.
I kind of want to hear Finn play because I've been seeing him with his guitar for so long.
yeah, that's for sure. But if anyone else also is interested in going soon,
this was tremendous. I really want us to keep doing this. Thank you very much, Andrea and Robbie, for your presentations today.
Not YouTube, for which the world.
Agreed. This is great.
Talk us further. Thank you for coming, everyone. And these very nice words.
What happens?
Thank you for letting me join.
What happens to anthropology after the Anthropocene?
Oh, we have Anacene, She's researching the mushrooms. We'll be fine. We're going to non-humans. We've already figured it out. We're one step ahead of this, So.
Once anthropologists are studying crystals and meditating, I'll believe. Just kidding.
I mean, they're doing it.
I'm just kidding.
There are cool stuff going on. There's some of our colleagues are working on minerals, for example, and mineral extraction. There's others who are working on pathogens. There's all sorts of stuff going on. It's beautiful.
Becoming non-human. This is true. Yeah.
And somehow that, I don't know, it's a long conversation, I guess, how they're connecting that to the social, but all of it is somehow structuring social. So, it's not just the human experience, it's how the objects and the physicality of the world is
That
structuring
sounds
social.
fascinating.
I mean, one of my colleagues is studying menstruation caps, for example, in Bolivia. Stuff like that. Others are with images, a bit classical by now. I mean, a bit boring by now. Plenty on power, usual stuff. I'm more inclined to always kind of hear to the ones who are taking on the old objects and trying to see what is it that they do with that. But the limits are, of course, there now because of COVID, right? You can't really go and see places, but there's nice stuff going on.
Even if you research humans, like me, I think I research humans. It's more so politics. What do I research, Dorota? I don't know. But
you don't know yet what you're researching. But don't worry.
But it has a lens which is non-human, the affect, the materiality of clinical walls and things like that, right? We've been pushing that method, I think, very almost aggressively. So yeah, there's more to it.
Is it possible to do like anthropological ethnography or produce data from like the recountings of dreams, or like does it have to be a recounted dream, and does the person have to choose it's worth telling as a dream, or is it okay to like, or what would be the equivalent of like
I don't know if you guys are aware of this.
Like you study diaries as anthropologists? Journals?
There is one of our colleagues who started a PhD at grad, and she's studying the diaries of Indian prisoners.
Ooh.
For example. She's using that as a material. And then, of course, she has to go back to the reading of, what it is to me in the diary, because it's a form of ethnography, but by somebody who's not trained, and she has to problematize that, and then there's other diaries of the past and how that kind of genre of writing about yourself once in prison developed. That's an interesting one. She's at the moment in the first year, so she's just starting.
But like dream work though, like
dreams, people don't really study dreams. That's there is one person who I also met who wants to study the use of illegal drugs in Bolivia or something, or Paraguay or something like that. But he's from political sciences, so he's not really. He only knows how the discourse around it is constructed and police. Not policing, but the politics of it, how it exists. But he wants to kind of show that this is also, of a valuable experience to the people that use that, and that is not really incorporated into the domain of politics. I don't know how he wants to do that, because I don't really know many people studying, the subjectivity under the substance. There are a couple of books on that. So there was this one guy who was studying marijuana smokers in New York. Sometime back, he wrote a book, and he was for 2 years smoking marijuana with these guys. And he wrote about that. That's an ethnographic study. There are a few interesting studies which are trying to deal with the embodiment of sorts. So one of my colleagues has been writing about jiu-jitsu in Brazil. He himself was doing jiu-jitsu in local clubs for 2 years. So then the descriptions are of what it is. I mean, I've read some of his descriptions, but so he tries to explain and describe how you know the other, your opponent, before you know them, right? So you recognize with all your muscles, there's a different kind of experience going on. You know what they're capable of just by measuring of their weight, just by having that embodiment of the fight within you. So these are some of the things that he's been writing about. But he's drawing from quite a famous study of a guy who's been studying boxing in America, and I think in Chicago, and he basically was boxing for 2 years with the black guys to the extent that he was about to drop out anthropology. He kind of embodied the sport so much. Stuff like that. I think they're the interesting ones for me anyway.
Dora, is there anything that you could share, or refer us to, specifically the guy who's writing about jiu-jitsu? I found that really interesting. I
can introduce you to the guy who's writing about the jiu-jitsu. No problem. He's lovely. He's in Berlin.
I recently fell into an article which I found really fascinating. I was reading about professional wrestling in relation to Brecht, and I found an anthropologist who was doing a similar thing, but in the context of learning like American professional wrestling, which is a physical thing, but also a form of performance and theater and really dance as well. So I would love to read more in that line. Cool.
So you want the jiu-jitsu guy? No problem. He's really cool. He's really easy.
If we get our song.
That's so sweet.
But what do you want to know? You want to know about how he describes the embodiment, or how he positions it within the larger domain of Brazilian, I don't know what, politics, or?
I mean, honestly, the first one I think is kind of like where I know right now, but I would love to explore the second, which I don't have any sense of. I think it'd be a great way to learn more.
I'll ask. No problem. We're happy. Some of us are happy to share. Not many, but some of us are happy.
Let's just all move to Berlin.
Oh man.
Right, Finn? Weren't we going to move to Berlin or German or something?
No, I'm down. Yeah, no. One of the goals for 2020 is to work on the German for plans for 2022. So we'll see.
Bada bim, bada bim, bada bim, bada bim, bada bim.
They're good. Okay, they're good guys. I'll talk to my friend.
I have a quick question for the anthropologists that somehow it's somehow related to Foucault and power, and also this notion that obviously the field or fields of anthropology are much different than they were in its the beginnings, 19th century. I mean, isn't there like initially, and I think this would be one of Foucault's insights, is like initially, didn't anthropologists, didn't they study sort of primitive people because there was this assumption that this primitive stage of existence was something that we experienced in the West earlier on? So right here you have this notion of power, of the whole idea of the observation, observing someone else. It has a strong, sense of power here. It's not. In other words, there's always power behind knowledge, or knowledge behind power, whichever.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what
right?
I mean? Like, I'm sure that you must have been the field has had to overcome that in some ways, and maybe they're still haunted by this. I don't know.
It's haunted. We still have stuff like decolonizing anthropology, conferences going on, and it almost never ends. Even if you have the so-called native anthropologist, whereby somebody from Africa goes to study their friends in Africa, he still is seen as this privileged kid, who is who's getting education in Switzerland or wherever in Europe or America, and then he's not really a proper native anymore. So, the very idea of privilege, because you've become the one who is there to study, suddenly becomes, it's problematic, and it cannot be overcome.
Exactly. Yeah, it can't be overcome. It's just
it can't be overcome.
It's not just class-based. It's also the accumulation of a different perception.
It's not so much like what the Komarovs, which are contemporary African anthropologists, importantly white South Africans, one of which has been accused of sexual harassment and abuse. So power 101. But they're a married couple. The Komarovs would say that Evans Pritchard, one of the first medical anthropologists in Africa, viewed them as primitive, but also said that there was a reasoning structure. It's not, inhumane idiots.
No, I'll also add to that is that actually what we recognize more and more is that we are the ones who are being kind of used and abused by the locals. So there's a reverse going on, right?
I've heard about these kind of spectacles. Oh, the whites are coming. Let's give them a big show.
It's not even the whites. It's not even
whatever.
The whites.
I mean, this is yeah.
It doesn't matter. There is a performance out there. People are learning, the performance. I mean, you may hear stories of performances back in the day, but now with the media, it's impossible to escape a performance. I don't know if you can penetrate through appearances into any form of real. The real disappeared. It never maybe existed, but now it's impossible.
I'm on board with the question of whether it really existed. Yeah.
His name is Eric Hobsbawm, English Marxist historian.
Yeah.
I mean, he's famous. Everyone's, I'm sure you've come across his work somehow. He edited this amazing collection of essays about like the fabrication of tradition. And all of these thinkers are looking and they're saying all of these kind of English traditions, for example, that are hearkening back to some sort of, pure origin or whatever it might be, were all constructed in the 19th century. like for example, Scotsmen wearing kilts. This is like something that emerged in the 19th century. It wasn't that, ancient Scotsmen were wearing kilts. It's something that, anyway, this is an interesting, what you said about the people who are being sort of the subjects, understanding that they're subjects and kind of performing this for the anthropologist or for the.
No, I will take it further. And in my experience, I think there's a particular type of instrumentalization going on where they know, where I am supposed, because I'm writing on Palestine, right? So I'm supposed to produce a particular kind of knowledge, which is towards advocacy, right? About Palestine. So and people like me are very much present. I mean, it's the continuous circulation of international community that is producing knowledge about Palestine. It's supposed to produce particular kind of knowledge about Palestine. And I have recognized myself as one which is their subject, you see. So, and that, I don't think it's only, Palestine per se, but we live in a very complex world whereby the fact that you're the one who produces knowledge doesn't mean that you're not a subject.
We're gonna run out
of the collective other.
Dorota, do you happen to know an anthropologist who did a lot of work in Palestine with Palestinian artists? He now teaches in Singapore. His name is Kevin Strom.
No, I don't know him.
Huh.
That sounds like Dorota.
No, he's a friend, and I recently reconnected with him, and he sent me some of his work, which seems to be really interesting. It's just that, anyway, go ahead.
No, I was quite involved in the Palestinian techno community at some point, and that was an interesting Palestinian techno.
He seemed
That's
to
like
be
the only
working
techno I
with
fuck with. That's cool.
visual artists and curators and.
No, I did meet some there, not because I intended to exactly, because it's just kind of everywhere.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. It's like if you were there, like people are.
Oh, you're surrounded by it. It's impossible to escape. It's in and it's out, right? What you see of Palestine here, it's there, but like 10 times more. Mm-hmm. And to me, it speaks of something. The fact that it's so intense. And it speaks of something else than cultural production per se. It speaks of a particular, of a continuous rehearsal of representation. That's what I'm trying to tease out. Which may be, again, going against a lot of people's perceptions, but that's just me. The techno community, on the other hand, is very interesting because it's like the most underground of the underground. And I was talking